Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live, our second of the day. Take a moment, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. I know I keep pounding that, and those of you who are watching probably already are subscribed, but find somebody and tell them to subscribe. But we're getting close to 8,000, as I keep saying, and yeah, that's a pretty cool milestone. So looking forward to that. So also support us on Patreon if you do not already. There's a link to do that in the show description. There's also a link to check out this book, um, which does have academic pricing, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit. But get your library to buy it, or get your school to use it for a course or something like that. It's a really cool book. Um, and Today we're going to talk about this book, which is called Ruptures in the Afterlife of the Apartheid City. Yousuf Al-Bulushi is our guest. And people probably know the organization more of, often we talk about the shack dwellers movement in South Africa. But their name, and I'm going to do my best, is Abahlali baseMjondolo. And I'm sure Yusuf will correct that pronunciation too. But our guest today is an associate professor of global and international studies at the University of California, Irvine. He works at the intersection of political theory, global political economy, African and African diaspora studies, critical theories of space and social movements in Africa and the Americas. Again, his book, Ruptures in the Afterlife of the Apartheid City, explores how shack dwellers in South Africa are confronting the persistent legacy of spatial segregation by experimenting with novel modes of political organization. There's a lot that we'll get into in terms of some of the debates that a really interesting book thinking about, thinking with a lot of Marxist scholarship historically, also in terms of discussions of transition, discussions of rupture, discussions of, uh, you know, how do movements move forward in a kind of post Cold War era, and then obviously thinking with decolonization and a lot more. So I look forward to talking about several of those elements today with our guests. So without further ado, Yusuf, welcome to the show. It's good to be with you.
Great to be here, Jared.
Yeah. Yusuf and I met, I should say this, we met at the Archives Unbound conference. And so, and we're going to at some point have another conversation too, to talk a little bit about Cedric Robinson. Um, but so it was great. There was an amazing conference and it was really cool to connect with a lot of people there. And I really appreciated your remarks there as well as just meeting you there. So I just wanted to say that for our audience and for those, other folks who may have been there or whatever. But let's just start. Let's start with you a little bit. So give us a little bit of your own background. You talk a little bit about, some of this in the acknowledgments and in the introduction, but you're influenced obviously by your own activism. I went back and looked because this is one of the things that I do now is like look to see if people had really terrible takes on Palestine. And you were, as like a student journalist, like giving really solid takes in the early 2000s. And I was thinking, man, I was an undergrad student at the same time, and I was not, I was anti-war, which was pretty rare on campuses at that time. But I didn't have as good analysis as what you were bringing in that moment. So kudos to you. But you've also been influenced, as you say, by your family and a number of different scholars and that have been mentors of you and so on. So I would love to just take a couple minutes and start there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks again for the intro and the invitation to be in conversation. It's a real pleasure. Big fan of the show. Yeah, definitely my own background shaped this project. There's no doubt about it. I was born in Bahrain, a small island country in the Persian Gulf, and moved to Seattle when I was relatively young. And I did my higher education in North Carolina, where I lived for quite a long time. I went to undergrad at Duke and did my PhD at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. My parents were a big influence on me. My mother is an American from Seattle who comes from a long line of educators. So education was always really important to her. Education with a purpose, right? It was driven into me at a young age that education was not about self-advancement, but it was about contributing to the world in some shape or form. And, her father was a school teacher. He's one of the people I dedicate the books to, my grandfather. And so that was always something instilled in me, and they played a kind of small role in their community in the Puget Sound in kind of integration in the local NAACP, which where they were was primarily a white organization. And on my father's side, he's from Tanzania and grew up as a colonial subject of Britain, first under colonialism and then with the transition to independence. And so, Tanzania has this incredible history on the African continent in terms of global socialist politics. And my dad was really shaped by that. He also is someone who believes really firmly in education, but really didn't have access to it at a higher level, kind of beyond secondary school, until we moved to the United States when he went back to school. At the same time I was in grade school, he went to community college first, and then to the University of Washington and got his bachelor's degree while he was working full time. But his experience growing up under colonialism in Tanzania and his educational experience, he went to the same school that Julius Nyerere had gone to, the Tabora Boys School, quite a well-known institution in the center of the country. And then beyond that was kind of like an organic intellectual. I mean, he was reading everything that was in that political milieu. So, on our bookshelf growing up, I would see copies of his books from the 60s and 70s, like an original copy of Wretched of the Earth that a friend of theirs from Madagascar had given to them and dedicated. Lenin's writings, Nyerere's writings, Issa Shivji's writings. These were the kind of books on our bookshelves, and our dinner table conversations were often about Middle East politics, African politics, the legacy of kind of radical anti-colonial socialist movements, and the ongoing kind of confrontation with Western hegemony and American imperialism, especially in the Middle East. So though that experience really shaped my politicization from a young age, right? I remember my mom putting a copy of Edward Said's Question of Palestine in my hands in 7th grade and saying, you're going to do your History Day project on Palestine, and you're going to start by reading this. And I still have that copy, and it's underlined in my 7th grade orange colored pencil. I can't claim to have understood it, but it certainly shaped me. And another big influence for me was my sister. I have an older sister who went away to college at Columbia University, immediately became involved in the late 90s on their campus activism, organizing around Palestine in a student organization called Turath, which is Arabic for heritage. So when I went to school at Duke, I basically just copied everything my sister did. I asked for her organization's constitution, bylaws, and I replaced the name Turath with the name Hiwar, which was Arabic for dialogue. And right away, we founded that organization and started doing work initially around fighting the sanctions against Iraq, and then also around the Second Intifada, supporting the Palestinian uprising, starting a divestment movement on campus to divest from Israel. So this was kind of the precursor, what was called then the Palestine Solidarity Movement, incubating kind of those spaces on college campuses and developing into a national network. It was a gathering at Berkeley that I attended with my sister, where they launched the PSM, then at University of Michigan. And then Duke eventually hosted it the year after I graduated. We hosted the kind of national movement of the Palestine Solidarity Movement, which eventually turned into Students for Justice for Palestine. So that was incredibly eye-opening for me to see the way that we were treated, the way that Palestinians were treated, the way that people who tried to prevent the invasion of Iraq were treated, right? We engaged in small forms of civil disobedience, took over campus government when they wouldn't discuss a resolution to denounce the invasion, block traffic on campus to draw attention to the war, small things like that. But the way we were talked about and represented also, underscored to me the real deep investment that our society had in kind of ongoing forms of imperialism. At the same time, I was taking classes at Duke, and I had applied to the school because I was interested in soccer, and I heard it was a decent school academically. Didn't make the soccer team, but was disappointed by my kind of peers in many cases, because it's a finishing school in many respects, right? The biggest employer of Duke graduates is Goldman Sachs, right? I think, at least that's what I was told. And I wasn't on campus a few months before there was an information session for Goldman Sachs in my freshman dorm, right? Which I had to attend. So, the notion that education was basically to go and make as much money as you possibly could was driven into me by the kind of student body in many respects. But Duke, for one reason or another, had an amazing group of radical faculty, and it had to a certain extent, institutionalized Marxism, which I eventually stumbled onto after initially being in engineering, then political science, and being like, this is not really the politics I had in mind, and finding my way to the literature program, which Fred Jameson, who recently passed away, had been involved with founding, and really had turned into a form of institutionalized study of Marxism. I got a certificate in Marxism as a part of my degree at Duke, and I was able to study with him, with Michael Hart, and to take a number of classes, that were concerned with kind of colonialism, its legacy, a class called Third World in the West, trying to understand why Europe was so rich and the rest of the world was still so poor. And building on my own kind of third worldist, internationalist roots and family background, I was always interested in African history, Middle East history, but also Latin American history. And my sister had, again, following in my sister's footsteps, she had begun to look at a kind of comparative study of the Middle East and Africa. She was doing human rights work at Columbia and was interested in transitional justice. And so she studied the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I decided for my senior research project that I wanted to do a comparative study of South Africa historically under apartheid and Palestine. And I was lucky that I had Karen Shapiro as a history of South Africa professor, Stephen Shiha as my Arabic professor, who then passed me on to Grant Farrett, a South African scholar who had studied with Edward Said and could also bring together my interests in kind of ongoing reality of colonialism in Palestine with my interest both in apartheid and the anti-apartheid movement. So, those political experiences and kind of experiences in the classroom helped shape me and form me at the same time that this was a moment of, the alter globalization movement globally. And I think I was interested in something beyond Palestine at the time because the situation there seemed so dire, and the kind of Latin American reference point seemed like it offered more hope in many respects, right? The Zapatista movement that had emerged in 1994, and then the whole pink tide socialist governments in Venezuela and elsewhere seemed to offer something important. So these were my interests that I kind of brought to bear locally in some ways, working with small organizations after I graduated to found social centers to try to enact a form of Zapatismo on a local level, right? The Zapatistas said, you don't need to help us. You need to go back home and fight neoliberalism from your own territory. So we were seeking to bring together communities of color, working class communities and students in local community centers, social centers that could kind of develop alternative life worlds, our own infrastructure for fighting gentrification, which was kind of our local understanding of how neoliberalism touched down in a city like Durham, while we were trying to build ties with other struggles. So this whole time, of course, right, while I'm trying to think locally or act locally, as they said at the time, thinking internationally still, Africa's in the back of my mind, right? And it's still central to my own formation, but I'm wondering, where is Africa in the newly emergent alter globalization movements, right? Africa was often referred to in the present as a site of civil war, famine, failed states, right? Even on the so-called progressive sectors, which is a site for human rights intervention. So that didn't seem to map onto the kind of more radical politics I was seeing emanating from Latin America, from the alter globalization movement in Europe, the United States. And to the extent that Africa surfaced in the radical stories, it was always in terms of history, right? The anti-colonial movement in the 60s and 70s, and Nkrumah, Nyerere, the anti-apartheid movement. But what about the present? So I was interested in African experiences in the alter globalization movement. And when I first learned about Abahlali, baseMjondolo, the shack dwellers movement in Durban, it immediately stood out to me as operating in a similar space as the alter globalization movement. I learned later that indeed they were in dialogue with people from Argentina, from Brazil, right? Unemployed workers. They had attended the World Social Forum. So here was a kind of African reference point in the present for radical politics that struck me as extremely important, that could think about what the legacy of the anti-colonial, anti-apartheid movements was in the present for radical struggles beyond what was offered up to us in the form of kind of human rights or interventions in civil war or aid, right, in the form of food aid. So a kind of contemporary reference point for African politics was quite interesting to me. And so I decided to make that the kind of focus of my graduate work. I was lucky to meet Subuzi Kode, one of the leaders of Abahlali, when he came to San Francisco with Raj Patel, and did a few events with housing activists in San Francisco. And I told him about my interests, and I said I was thinking about coming to South Africa. He said, please do come and talk with us. And I worked at UNC with John Pickles, who was an English-American geographer who had done his PhD in Durban at the University of Natal in the 1970s and 80s, and had done some research on the kind of economy of the Bantustans, the traditional apartheid homelands. What were they like economically? He was interested in, and had been quite active in the anti-apartheid struggle in England and the United States and in South Africa. And he generously connected me to a whole series of people in South Africa that proved crucial. Eunice Saleh in African studies at UNC was crucial. She's a Kenyan scholar who was working in Durban at the time. And I told her at the time that my two project ideas were either to do a kind of intellectual history of the Dar es Salaam school, which was my more personal ties I had to through my dad, or kind of the study of the shack dwellers. And she said, go to South Africa. It's where all the interesting movements are right now. And you can come back to the kind of Dar project later, or do that in the background, which is exactly what I did. So I was really fortunate to have John Pickles, to have Eunice Saleh, to have a bunch of African studies scholars who really operated below the radar at UNC because of the geopolitical marginalization of Africa and the world of knowledge. Literally nobody is interested, right? People like Barakat Selassie, who had worked for Haile Selassie, had attended the All-African People's Congress in Accra in 1958, had translated for Fanon at that Congress. He was a professor at UNC. You know, he formed a part of the Eritrean liberation movement. George Nzongola Ntalaja, really well-known Congolese scholar, author of A People's History of the Congo. He's currently was serving as the DRC's representative to the UN, and I believe ambassador to South Africa potentially. So these kinds of people are on campus, and I could sit down with them because not very many other people were interested in Africa and talking to them and learning from them. And so I was really quite fortunate to be nurtured by all of these scholars, people like Joseph Jordan, Perry Hall, a founder of Black Studies. And that's where the kind of project began at UNC with some of that background.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I was looking around for a book. I have essays on revolution and counter-revolution in Africa by Georges Nzonga. I mispronounce his name. I'm terrible.
Nzongola, yeah.
Yeah. So that's great. Thank you for all of that. It was really cool to hear that, hear those aspects of your story. So let's start with some context for the book. I mean, you do a good job in the book of situating, the I think a lot of the really important theoretical, and kind of looking at the movement, does base around go ahead, correct me.
Abahlali.
Abahlali. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
nailed it.
Does focus around Abahlali, but but there's context that's important up front, right? Is to talk about what happened with South Africa's transition, and you do take a view which I appreciate, which is sort of like, and maybe we talk about this a little bit, and I think I may have a question about it later on, but like there's a lot of people who would sort of read South Africa and say, okay, the ANC became a kind of neo-colonial, sort of manager of South Africa. And I don't know that you necessarily would disagree or agree with that, but you don't focus there as, you kind of look at it in terms of when did the ANC, take over? What were the conditions of that transition? What were the possibilities of that transition and the limitations? And then also think about how then do people organize from below in that context? And so let's start with a little bit of the background on South Africa and how you understand the transition, probably transitions, because you transition is a kind of theme in this book, post the fall of formal apartheid, right? Of de jure, I guess, apartheid, right? There's a new constitution, which we will come back to because it plays an important role. And this happens after, of course, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the Eastern Bloc countries are all, not crumbling, but returning to capitalism in this period, crumbling maybe too. And there's, a rise of kind of hegemonic neoliberalism. This is the sort of end of history, so-called moment. And, now a parliamentary government that now Black South Africans can participate in formally, right? And so start with some of your assessment of that initial transition and maybe some of the gains that were made and some of the limits and, basic realities that had to be confronted at that time.
Yeah, sure. And I think you've put it really nicely there, because I think that context is crucial. It's really important, right? If we think about South Africa overthrowing apartheid by 1990, 1994, right? And that comes on the heels of what people like John Saul called a 30-year war for independence in Southern Africa. Many countries in Africa began to get their independence in the late 50s, early 60s. And then slowly over the next 30 years, many of them would have to continue to fight for their independence. And some of those that had to fight the hardest and engage in armed struggle were also the site of significant settler populations that were trying to hold on to power as a kind of proxy for colonial rule, really a continuation of colonial rule, with the colonizers now taking on the moniker of locals, right? So there was this 30-year war from 1960 to 1990 in which much of Southern Africa was still colonized. For example, Mozambique, Angola, right, having to fight for independence from 1960 to 1974, 75. And then no sooner did they win independence, but these new kind of socialist governments, Frelimo and MPLA, were embroiled in civil war because of external interventions to destabilize those new socialist governments. And because South African apartheid government knew that those new socialist governments were going to support the anti-apartheid struggle. Same thing with Zimbabwe, right? Having engaged in an armed struggle and only winning independence around 1980. So the anti-apartheid struggle kind of reaches its pinnacle at the end of this wave of anti-colonial movements throughout Southern Africa. Really protracted struggles that had seen so many people die in civil wars and forms of intervention. And some of those civil wars were ongoing in places like Angola, even when South Africa won independence. But there was a difference between winning independence or overthrowing the vestiges of colonial rule in 1960, like, earlier countries, Ghana, DRC, Tanzania, they'd all won their independence around then, and winning it in 1990, right? The conjuncture had shifted, right? And the viability of state socialism and the promises of an anti-colonial movement, which were often linked to kind of the promises of a global socialist movement, was really in ruins by the time apartheid was overthrown in 1990, and the first transitional period between 1990 and 1994 kind of took place. So that's the context in which Nelson Mandela is released from prison in 1990. And we can see that now, 3 decades after the first formal elections were held in 1994 under a formally democratic country. We can look back in retrospect at these 3 decades of rule and some of the challenges the country has faced and see that right from the outset, the ANC is given the reins of power in a context, as you said, defined by the end of socialism as a viable political project, and actually the end of socialist states in the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union that were in some significant ways helping to prop up and support socialist experiments in other parts of the world. So as a material alternative, right, really facing challenges, as a discursive intellectual alternative, challenged from all sides, and the anti-apartheid movement that comes to power, the African National Congress, which we should note is just one wing of the anti-apartheid movement that in retrospect has tried to reproduce the history as solely their own, right? When we know there are many different currents to the anti-apartheid struggle, but nonetheless, the most prominent ANC has to take the reins of power at this conjuncture, right? When neoliberalism is seen as the only viable political form, political economic model, political form of government, right, that could be accepted. So that's one of the initial challenges that they face, and that plagues Nelson Mandela's first and only term in office from 1994 to 1999. Now, we should note that this moment of transition was preceded by a fascinating period in the anti-apartheid movement, arguably maybe the most fascinating in the mid to late 1980s, right, when the peak of the boycott movement and the sanctions movement that began first with other African countries and eventually spread to the West, right, had its power. But it's also a period that scholars like Michael Neocosmos called a period of people's power, right, where you had mass democratic initiative from below while the ANC was in exile. And that period of people's power was kind of eclipsed by the formal transition that the ANC adopted from above, starting in the 1990 and ending in 1994. So that period is a period of transition from apartheid to liberal democracy. But in addition to the kind of foreclosure of socialist politics in many respects, the ANC was facing the threat of internal civil war. Right? I already mentioned how Mozambique, Angola were plagued at the moment of transition to independence by civil war, by the propping up of proxies in the form of Renamo in Mozambique, right, which the apartheid government had supported, FNLA, and UNITA in Angola. And South Africa was facing a similar situation. Not only was there the prospect for all-out war with the apartheid population, the white settler community, and those that did not want to relinquish power, but as is always the case, and as scholars like Mahmoud Mamdani have noted, colonialism itself didn't operate primarily through direct rule. It often operated through indirect rule, in which you had to gain the consent of certain indigenous members of the elite, right? The African continents, what were called by colonial administrators tribal authorities. And that was certainly the case in South Africa. So people like Mamdani point us to the fact that while South Africa is seen as somewhat exceptional in the African context, because it took so long to become independent, economically because it's a much more wealthy society, politically, the model of indirect rule that South Africa had, that apartheid represented by outsourcing rule to these Bantustans, these native administrations in traditional Zulu homeland, for example, in KwaZulu-Natal, was the model of colonial rule elsewhere, all over the African continent. And by virtue of having outsourced rule to particular quote unquote tribal leaders, the apartheid government could rely upon those tribal rulers in some senses for support or to destabilize the anti-apartheid struggle. And a Zulu nationalist Inkatha movement, based also where Durban is, where the shack dwellers are, in the province of Natal, what became KwaZulu-Natal, was the biggest threat to the ANC also in this period of transition. It wasn't just the white apartheid government and their followers, it was the prospects of violent infighting between this ethnically identified remnant of apartheid rule, the Inkatha movement, Zulu nationalist movement, and the ANC, on the other hand, that was supposed to be a multiracial, multi-ethnic, right, nationalist struggle. And there was tremendous violence between these two groups all over the country during this transitional period that threatened to get even worse. So these were some of the challenges that the ANC faced, and they decided in that context to make a series of compromises in order to prevent the Civil War from really getting worse, right, in their argument, and also to prevent the potential all-out war with vestiges of the settler power and the National Party. So to answer your question about what was gained as a result of this and what were some of the limits, the concrete limits, right? As a result of those compromises, the ANC won kind of an end to legalized racial discrimination. They won a liberal democracy where one person, one vote was the rule of the land, which apartheid had expressly kind of foreclosed, made impossible. But it also led to competing kind of macroeconomic strategies as a result of these compromises. On the one hand, you had this reconstruction and development plan that they put out in 1994, which was broadly Keynesian in orientation, some socialist, even some neoliberal principles, but more progressive, right? Calling for example, block tariffs, where those who consumed more water would pay more for it, and those who consumed less would pay less. Called for the provision of services that people needed to survive, that you had to provide those, and subsidies, people couldn't pay for them. Called for redistribution of wealth, right, from businesses to workers and consumers. And the RDP, this Reconstruction Development Plan, also led to the building of 1 million houses by the end of Mandela's term, by the early 2000s, the turn of the century. That's a big accomplishment. So there are some improvements in access to healthcare, electricity, and water. And as I said, part of the success was avoiding a mass civil war. We should remember 1994 is not just the moment when the ANC is shepherded into power, but it's the moment of the Rwandan genocide, right? So there's two prospective futures for Africa at that exact moment. And for people like Mamdani, the compromises that the ANC undertook were in order to prevent civil war, and that was a success. On the other hand, there's some serious limits and failures, right? We already mentioned one big limit, the global neoliberal consensus, right? There's only one path. It's the free market. Liberal democracy is synonymous with the free market, and you're crazy if you think otherwise. This new ANC has to raise funds for their developmental promises. Where are they going to do that? How are they going to do that? With what assistance? If it's international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, well, we know by this point, neoliberalism is the law of the land for them as well. And they're going to have to make certain concessions to that neoliberal consensus if they want to receive aid, if they want to be welcomed into this international community, engage in free trade, right? At the same time, the ANC was faced with the reality of what we called in the United States white flight. And this was white flight internationally and domestically, right? So domestically, like the US, the second cities, which had been the bastion of white power under apartheid, were integrated. White citizens and businesses often fled to the surrounding suburbs. One, because they just didn't want to socially integrate schools, businesses, their world. Two, because they thought maybe they could avoid the tax implications of living in the city and the redistributive, implications of that, something that the ANC later, through their spatial planning, prevented them from doing, but that's what they were facing. But then internationally, there was white flight too, right? We have between 5 and 6 million white South Africans, depending on what period you're looking at. Almost 1 million of them left the country. So rather than live under a Black government, right, over the next few decades, 1 million white South Africans went to Canada, the United States, England, Australia, some to Dubai, the Gulf countries. And when they left, they took all of their infrastructure, their know-how, as former colonized countries know with the problem of brain drain, and they often moved their businesses, doing things like relisting them from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange to the London Stock Exchange. So this is capital flight, right? And if you want to develop, any country knows you need a certain amount of capital. And if the people who have concentrated capital in their hands as a result of colonialism and apartheid just leave with it, right? And you haven't yet implemented measures to restrict that capital flight in an era of neoliberal free market, right, flow of money, then what do? Where are you going to get the resources to redistribute wealth, right? Where are you going to get the resources to create jobs? But the ANC was obviously partially to blame themselves, because at the same time that they had this RDP program in 1994, they passed a growth, employment, and redistribution plan in 1996 that was much more neoliberal and focused on the need to balance budgets, reduce deficits, right? Only provide services if you could engage in forms of cost recovery. This was a much more neoliberal macroeconomic strategy that was in tension with their earlier articulated one, and it kind of won the day. And as a result of that, right, we saw unbelievable high rates of unemployment that have plagued post-apartheid South Africa, between 25 and 35%, right? That's between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 people who want a job can't get a job. That's the official numbers. The unofficial numbers are 40 to 50, right? That's just an insane level of unemployment. There's all sorts of other indicators, like the inability or unwillingness of the ANC government to really grapple with AIDS at the time. They were essentially an AIDS denialist, right, government. So that's some of the structural limits, but also a certain degree of complicity of the ANC. And they weren't always opposed to neoliberalism, because the ANC also represented, in many senses, the interests of this newly emergent Black bourgeoisie, right? And so the tension between their own aspiring interests and the kind of struggle objectives, right, then came to a head really quickly at the end of apartheid, and also plagued their rule, and has plagued their rule to this day.
Right on. Well, now we know how we got Elon Musk. He immigrated in 1989, right before. So anyway,
Yeah.
but I wanted to pick up. I mean, you mentioned AIDS there at the end, and this is one of the movements that you talk about, and there are others too, thinking about like moving us. Now that you've given us some of that context of this initial transition, one of the things that you then do in the book is talk about some of the movements that we might see as antecedents of Abahlali, like some of the things that show a kind of different type of organizing, I guess, recognizing that South Africa becomes essentially a one-party state. Not there are other parties, but the ANC has a really strong ruling consensus for quite a while. It's just now starting to face some challenges that way. But then people have to organize in this context around various issues from below. And so talk a little bit about some of those movements that you looked at that kind of lead up to, the shack dwellers movement.
Yeah, the this post-apartheid consensus, this neoliberal consensus, what some scholars would call like a post-political consensus, because it abandons the terrain of contestation that is supposedly defines the political, in the name of producing a kind of consensus around neoliberal macroeconomic strategies, and kind of the consensus of liberal, electoral politics as well, and all of the ways that guts radical politics. That consensus began to be ruptured with some of these movements in the late 90s and early 2000s. The most notable among them was a movement fighting to bring greater attention to those who were living with HIV and AIDS. And this was the Treatment Action Campaign, the TAC. This was a globally important movement because, right, it came during the heyday of HIV AIDS, but it emanated from the epicenter of the AIDS crisis, right, in South Africa and the African continent, right, it's the highest rates of HIV AIDS in the world. And so the very same people suffering with HIV and AIDS now took to the streets to directly confront their own government, to call out the AIDS denialism that certainly Thabo Mbeki, who took over from Nelson Mandela in 1999 as president of the country, of the ANC, and led the country for the next roughly 10 years. Right? He was a de facto AIDS denialist. And how could it be these poor people suffering with HIV and AIDS, living with HIV and AIDS, argued, that their own country would deny the reality of the disease and therefore deny both the treatment that was required for them and would deny the kind of political economic strategy to fight the drug companies, right, who wanted to profit from the drugs that had been developed to treat people living with HIV and AIDS. So this was a confrontationalist movement, civil disobedient movement, but a movement that linked a question of health in the form of HIV/AIDS to the broader political economy of neoliberalism. But the TAC, even though they took direct action, disrupting meetings, protesting in the streets, calling out their government, they didn't really fully break with the ANC. They saw their position still in the late 90s, early 2000s as being an internal critic, more of an internal critic of the ANC, holding them to task in hope that the ship could right itself as a result of popular pressure. And indeed, they won access. It's a huge victory to antiretroviral treatments, right, which saved, we don't know how many lives, right? It's a huge, huge victory, the Treatment Action Campaign. Another movement that was emblematic in this regard of this rupturing with the post-apartheid consensus was the anti-eviction campaign, which emerged in Cape Town, the province of the Western Cape. And whereas the TAC was focused on the question of health, the AEC, the anti-eviction campaign, was focused on housing. And they were calling attention to the fact that one of the paradigmatic forms of dispossession that the apartheid government had used, right, which was to evict people from their homes in neighborhoods that were integrated, potentially, and to displace them, relocate them either to segregated townships on the peripheries of the cities or to segregated Bantustans in the countryside. Right? This was a paradigmatic apartheid technology, had not died with the end of apartheid, but that its use now was justified no longer on the basis of racial spatial planning, but on the basis of simple economics. If you weren't paying your rent, right, you could be evicted, right? But the outcome was the same for poor people, they argued. And in a context of mass unemployment and, abandonment of the more radical political economic objectives of the anti-apartheid movement, the AEC argued that it's the same thing for them, right? They're still facing eviction. And once you lose your home, you have no ground on which to stand, no ground on which to reproduce yourself, your family. And so they were bringing attention to the fact that evictions continued after apartheid was over, but now under this neoliberal structure were justified by economic terms, but were conducted with violence still, right? Led by the state. Another really important movement that, like the AAC, began to point the finger at the ANC and the new government as part of the problem was the landless people's movement. And this emerged, I think, primarily in the area around Johannesburg, in Gauteng, and in the immediately surrounding countryside, calling attention to the fact that the most important struggle objective, which was land redistribution, had been abandoned by the ANC, had not in fact taken place. Right? There was a sense during the anti-apartheid movement that liberation would bring with it a redistribution of the land that had been unjustly taken from them. Right? From the origins of the colonial project in South Africa in 1652, but then again legally in the 1910s, when acts were passed that forbid, right, indigenous population from owning land in 85 to 90% of the country. So clearly, if you're going to overthrow that structure, you have to redistribute the land that was unjustly taken by a settler population to the indigenous population. And the Landless Peoples Movement engaged in calling attention to the lack of land redistribution and engaged in land occupations, right? If the state is not going to enact land redistribution from above, then the LPM said, we're going to enact it from below. We're going to start taking land and organizing people under the banner of our movement, the LPM. And another movement that was really important, also based in Johannesburg, was the Anti-Privatization Forum, the APF. And they drew attention to the fact that so many of the basic services that people needed to survive, who the forms of electricity, water, sanitation, right, were potentially being privatized under this neoliberal transition, or were subject to the kind of ethos of privatization in public-private partnerships or in cost recovery programs, where the cost of providing those services was now passed on to the quote-unquote consumer rather than to the citizen who has rights. And so they challenged this kind of neoliberal bent of privatization that was emblematic of global neoliberalism at the time. They pointed the finger at the local ANC for its complicity with rewriting service provision according to the laws of neoliberalism. And they engaged in what many other movements were doing at the time, something Abahlali has picked up on, which is kind of struggle reconnectivities to the electrical grid, right? They would hack into the electrical grid and to get electricity, and they celebrated that. They supported people in their neighborhoods that needed to do that for survival purposes. So these were some of the initial movements in the late 1990s to early 2000s, some of the most prominent ones that collectively began to shift the tenor of this post-apartheid rainbow nation moment, kumbaya moment. And it was clear from their interventions that not only was all not well, but that the ANC was going to be called out directly by the very same South African citizens who'd brought them to power, poor Black workers and unemployed people, right? And they also began to point their finger at this newly emerging political economic global structure of neoliberalism that they saw the ANC as kind of complicit with rather than challenging to support their own needs.
Awesome. Appreciate that. So let's talk about Abahlali a little bit. You get into let's talk about some of the problems and the conditions that this movement arose in, which you just laid out some of those problems and conditions, but where they gain their strength as a movement too. And it gets into, there's an interesting question that you're grappling with in the text, which is kind of also, and many others have grappled with this as well, is just sort of the question of the kind of revolutionary subject, right? And there's of course the old school Marxists, sort of idea of the worker, right, being the revolutionary subject because of the shop room floor and his position at the point of production and the ability to democratize, but also to directly confront capital in that space. And obviously, as you've laid out, with the high degree of unemployment, with the struggles over basic needs, social reproductive needs of social reproduction, kind of that doesn't always make sense in every context, and certainly with the way that what we call deindustrialization or neoliberalism. I mean, South Africa is an interesting context because it did have, as you talk about in the text, there's a pretty high degree of development compared to a lot of other countries in Africa, which I know we'll kind of get into the developmental course discussion later. But but you also have, as you say, this kind of the capital flight and the new reality, right, that people have to deal with in this post-apartheid moment. And this organization is really interesting. I mean, the way that they organize themselves, I know we'll get more into some of their programs and things like that later on, but just start there. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the conditions and the problems and how they're organizing, you know, who's involved in the movement and the problems they're seeking to address.
Yeah. So Abahlali emerges kind of at the moment when some of those other new social movements are being eclipsed, running into internal debates, funding problems, the early 2000s. And Abahlali emerges in 2005 and really carries on the mantle of some of those other earlier movements. And they emerge in Durban, which is kind of the third most prominent city in the country. Most people know of Johannesburg. It's based in the center of the country, close to where the wealthiest mines are. That's why it is where it is, because of the discovery of gold and diamonds in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And Cape Town is the other most prominent city, which was the first city that colonizers settled in 1652. So Durban is the third most prominent city. It's in the southeast of the country, again in the province of Natal, what today is KwaZulu-Natal, on the Indian Ocean. And Abahlali emerges there in 2005 at a community called Kennedy Road, which is both a physical road and the site of a shack community that takes the name of the road, which is located adjacent to the municipal dump, right? So this is where all the waste in the city is left. And this is kind of emblematic of the rise of shack communities already under apartheid, and certainly since the end of apartheid. They often are set up in the interstices of urban space, in places like land that's immediately adjacent to municipal dump, which the city has not zoned for housing or which is deemed uninhabitable because of pollution, but it's the only open land that poor people have access to, and so they set up shop there. And the residents of Kennedy Road had been engaged in a protracted struggle with their own local ward councillor representative, and with some of the surrounding neighborhoods. This was in a neighborhood called Clare Estate, which under apartheid had been zoned as kind of Indian or Asian. So it bears noting that, the vast majority of people who have to live in shack settlements are African or Black, depending on what term you want to use under contemporary racial terms in post-apartheid South Africa. So there's tensions with their neighbors, with these homeowners, right, in a primarily Asian community. But there's also tension with the government structures and the councillors there, because these are people who have been promised homes, and they don't see their local councillor, right, realizing that. They suspect their local councillor of a series of corrupt measures, taking payouts to provide some people for homes and other people not with homes, colluding with homeowners in the surrounding community and not with the shack dwellers. And this leads them eventually to decide that, we need to break with the ANC, first and foremost at the level of our particular community, Kennedy Road, that the ANC representatives here are clearly not working in our interest. And what are some of the needs of people living in shack communities like this? They're quite material and concrete, right? If you've moved into a shack community, you've set up a home on abandoned, precarious land that is not connected to the electrical grid, that is not connected to the sanitation system. It's not connected to water, doesn't have its own school service, doesn't have its own roads, doesn't have sanitation set up. So these are all things you have to either provide for yourself, right? Or fight for the state to deliver to you. And these are questions of life and death for these communities, because oftentimes shack communities are set up with whatever spare material people can find around, right? That they can gather, often from the dump itself. That's another reason people lived there, is because they were going there anyways to get scrap material to build their houses, scrap pieces of aluminum, of wood, whatever you could find. And because there's no zoning, oftentimes people set up shacks and land is limited right next to each other. So these can be quite cramped quarters. And because there's no access to the electrical grid, people still need to cook to eat in their home. So they might use a paraffin, kerosene stove. But if you have one of those in cramped quarters with a baby or kids running around, or if there's bad weather and you're trying to cook and you turn your attention away for 1 second, those stoves can tip over quite easily. And when one shack ignites, many other shacks can immediately set on fire. They're often not confined to just one home. And it spreads so quickly that what seems kind of not that consequential in an immediate sense, like not having access to electricity, can mean in the context of a paraffin stove turning over, hundreds of people losing their lives. This is a regular occurrence in these communities. So Abahlali formed in the context of fighting for access to these bare necessities for survival, with the ultimate goal of hopefully winning access to homes that had been promised according to that Reconstruction and Development program that I mentioned. In fact, they were so aligned with that program that people called state-built homes RDP houses, right? That would give you a little bit more permanency, tenancy, access to services, ideally. And in the context of knowing that they had to continue to mobilize to push the government if they wanted access to those services and to homes as well. But their politicization advances to the point where they realize, as they sit down and study the problems that they're facing, that part of the reason they're in the material condition that they're in was because poor people are simply discounted at all levels, and principally for them, intellectually. They're not considered people worthwhile consulting or engaging when the state embarks upon planning a city. These are people who should just receive services if they're lucky and if they comport themselves well enough. But they're not people who should plan how those services should be delivered or should be consulted in any shape or form that's meaningful about what they want their community to look like and what the problems are that they're facing. So after repeated interactions with the state, now a state led primarily by the ANC, they become convinced that the structuring, governing logic of the state is one that discounts the dignity of the poor, and foremost amongst the dignity of the poor that they insisted upon was their ability to think for themselves, right? That's what they kept seeing as discounted in their interactions with the state, and why they eventually decided to, in a sense, break with an ANC that they no longer saw as taking their dignity into consideration in any way, shape, or form. So with regards to your question around who the revolutionary subject is, this becomes quite interesting in the South African context, because South Africa has a tremendous radical history, and more so than other societies, arguably, certainly in Africa, kind of institutionalized left. This is a country in which the Communist Party never went away and currently sits in government together with the ANC, right? It's part of the tripartite government, an alliance between the ANC, South African Communist Party, and COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions. So there's a strong institutionalized left tradition. There's also strong tradition of Trotskyism, people who broke with or never felt comfortable in the Communist Party because of its Stalinist allegiances, or because of its economism in one shape or form, or because of its belief in socialism in one country, right? For any number of reasons, people who have organized and have been quite successful in the university, but who also try to form partnerships with the labor movement and with poor people, generally speaking. There's also a very rich tradition of all sorts of forms of Black nationalist movements, right? There's a tradition of struggle emanating from the Black consciousness movement, traditional struggle emanating not just from the ANC, but the Pan-African Congress as well. A tradition that goes all the way back to Garveyism when it touched on South African shores. So there are all these kind of radical traditions of struggle, but the institutionalized left, despite its strength, arguably is still plagued by certain forms of dogma, hierarchy, and notions of vanguardism that still align the notion of struggle to the position of the worker. And so even though some of the best amongst them, certainly in the Trotskyist spaces, have realized that many of the new social movements didn't emerge on the shop floor, but emerged in community settings around issues like the ones I mentioned earlier, healthcare, right, around land and countryside, around housing. These are questions of social reproduction, the bare necessities of everyday life, rather struggles around the shop floor for a wage or for control over the means of production, right, in an immediate sense. So they've realized that, and there are efforts amongst the best of them to support movements like Abahlali. But there is still, I feel like, remnants of those old left orthodoxies that see organizations like Abahlali and their membership as workers in waiting. That if only these people can actually enter formal jobs, to form a union, right, or join our political party, right, which is still the orthodox model of organizing in these contexts, then they can actually be effective, right? And that means, in a sense, outsourcing the subjectivity of a shack dweller to that of a political party or of a union. Now, many of the people who are shack dwellers are or have been workers or involved in political parties in the anti-apartheid movement. Members of the ANC form many of them, or other parties. But Abahlali's politics is predicated on the notion that the poor and the shack dweller have an ability to think for themselves and don't need to be workers necessarily, or in a political party, which they're quite critical of as a structure of organization, led quite often by middle-class intellectuals, right? It's the notion of a vanguard argues, in order to be politically effective. So in a sense, they scramble and they confuse those old models of doing politics, which even as they've evolved, I think, and I think Abahlali feels, still are kind of plagued by old understandings of the worker as a revolutionary subject. And that's why Abahlali identifies as a shack dweller, right? And as the poor. These are slightly different characterizations of who they are and how they're struggling. Now, they want to work with, and we can talk about that later if you want, any and all other organizations, with workers, with intellectuals, right? With other people in other countries. It's not that they don't believe in the workers' movement. They identify as a socialist movement. They often sing the Internationale these days at their meetings, right? But it's a kind of different lineage of internationalist socialism from the kind of either the CP or even the Trotskyist lineages that still remain active in the country, in the government, or in the university spaces, and often therefore struggle to understand or relate to or really connect with on the basis of a dignified relationship of equals with organizations like Abahlali.
Yeah, right on. I mean, in their About Us section, even on their website these days, they actually even use the word. So they say, we are committed to building the democratic power of the oppressed from below and using our collective strength to create a world which land, wealth, and power are shared fairly, a communist world, they actually say, and so we work to build a movement of communes and an international movement of movements. So yeah, I know we'll get more into their organization. I actually want to piggyback off of that, and if you're following the questions I wrote, I'm jumping to 8, and I'll still come back to some other stuff. But because somebody else brought up that what you're describing, here is exactly what got Frank B. Wilderson fired from his teaching gig at South African University. Wilderson simply outlined these exact facts to white students, and they're referencing his memoir Afro-Pessimism. But this is something that you deal with in the text, is the kind of thinking about Abahlali alongside Afro-pessimism to a degree, and certainly around the dynamics of anti-blackness. And so you talk about the dynamics of anti-blackness and settler colonialism in this text, and I think that's very important and interesting as well, because South Africa, we talked about this a little bit earlier today, and it's other folks have brought it up. African folks have brought this up for years, but that, like in Patrick Wolf's, sort of argument, African countries are considered countries with settlers, but not settler colonies, in his framework. And I think part of the thing that he couldn't quite deal with is what you're talking about, is that his framework was built on, dispossession and taking of land and basically the genocide of the native population. But in a context like South Africa, it did involve the dispossession and the taking of land, but it also required a certain amount of black labor to then do all of the work of the capital extraction as well. And so it couldn't be, completely eliminationist in some of the ways that it might have been in certain other contexts. And, to pull more things into this, but one of the claims that Afro-pessimists have around anti-black violence has been that, black people constitute internal enemies of, civil society, and often in a kind of, Gramscian or a Marxist framework, we talk about the need to engage in these wars of position and war of the maneuver within all of these civil society organizations, right? And so that's really what I wanted to talk about a little bit, is how Abahlali then organizes with respect to civil society, to NGOs, to political parties. And, I think it offers, some really interesting lessons, I mean, I think about movements that, in Philadelphia, we have a really strong kind of set of people that organize around housing, and, you know, I think in many ways this is like a great example of, an aspiration, right, for that kind of organizing. And I don't want to romanticize it at all, because as you've talked about, like, these are really, egregious conditions that people are organizing in, and there's again a great amount of state violence, to go back to Wilderson's point, that is deployed against them as well. So talk a little bit about why Abahlali takes the stances it does, as far as you could tell, with regards to these different parties and civil society organizations, and how they think that opens up greater possibilities. I mean, certainly they've had some successes too, and we should probably point to that as well.
Yeah, okay, lots of great stuff in this question. And kind of anti-blackness, settler colonialism, civil society is how I would maybe summarize it, and I'll try to.
Yeah, that would be a much simpler way of me laying it out than what I did. But
no, it was great. What you said was great, really great. So I'll start just with this question of anti-blackness, from my own experience and understanding of it. The first time I went to South Africa in 2011, I was kind of shocked by the degree of what I kind of read as a real deeply entrenched colorblindness that pervaded everything in the society, and which coexisted alongside what seemed to me to be, indisputably ongoing forms of racism and anti-blackness specifically, right? There was a real refusal, inability, unwillingness to kind of, in my experience and kind of reading the spaces I was in, to name racism, to name race, and to use racial categories in any shape or form. And I eventually came to understand or believe that part of that was due to the kind of specific way that the anti-apartheid movement had adopted a kind of anti-racist struggle through what they called non-racialism, which is a very kind of obscure word. It's not often defined in a super clear manner, but it became one of the leading terms, certainly within the ANC, for naming what the struggle objective was. And that was not just an objective of the post-apartheid world, but it was going to be the means to get there as well, right? That we were going to organize on a non-racial basis. And of course, there's a difference between anti-racist and non-racial, right? At least from in a US context. And there, you could see how non-racialism might slip into color blindness, which is to say a belief that we're going to confront the all-pervading nature of racism that apartheid has produced in our society by refusing to use their categories, refusing to identify in racial categories, because that's what apartheid is obsessed with imprisoning us in. But as all kinds of people have argued, right, it's really difficult to overcome racism unless you allow yourself to name it first and foremost. And you're kind of stuck in this bind of having to use racial categories in order to name it. So that's maybe part of the reason why there was a kind of struggle over, my experience at least, a real intense color blindness. And it was clear to me, and this became really clear just a few years later after I got there, when South African society exploded along, in forms of racial consciousness, new Black consciousness, and became intensely interested in, oftentimes we see this throughout the world as different societies are undergoing parallel forms of explosions of Black consciousness, like Brazil or Colombia. Many of them will turn to, in all kinds of exciting ways, kind of Black diaspora texts, in particular texts coming out of the United States. So I began to see in 2012 and 2013, first signs of this were going to college campuses in South Africa and seeing people reading Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow. And you might be like, well, why are they reading New Jim Crow in South Africa? That's a strange text. Well, it's a popular text. It's coming from the US, and it's naming the kind of persistence of an old structure of racial rule into the present. And that would be my guess. And from talking to people, I think that was maybe the interest. Oh, maybe this can give me some language to explain what I'm feeling, but I don't have access to naming. Of course, other people immediately were being read. Angela Davis, The Resurgence of Fanon, and the Afro-Pessimists were also being intensely read. Tanai Mupotsa has a really interesting piece talking about the kind of three different currents in the Roads Must Fall, Feeds Must Fall student movement, Afro-pessimism being a really important one as well. And I think that it had a certain purchase in the student movement for precisely that really strange disjuncture that I felt, right? A deep commitment to not discussing race at the same time that the material reality of society seems so clearly defined, not only by race, but by anti-Blackness specifically, right? And so what does that look like actually on the ground there? Well, electorally, and maybe we can get to this if you want to, discuss those politics a little bit later, and to the detriment of movements like the Black consciousness movement that people like Steve Biko were so active in, and who used a political form of Blackness that argued, one, Blackness it's not something that you're born into, but it's something you become politically. And that it's also not just limited to people of African descent, but includes all people of color, the colored community, the Asian community, anybody who was not white and was fighting the structure of white power was then Black, according to Black consciousness. And there's a way in which some people on the political left still want to use those categories in contemporary South Africa. At the same time, we see a countervailing move, which is an abandonment of that old political form of Blackness. And we see, to use the terms of Wilderson, a kind of coalescing of not only white people, but their junior partners in other communities of color around an anti-Black alliance. So the main African political party, the ANC, again, I've already argued they don't actually represent the interests of African people, but that's how they're viewed, is primarily voted for by African people. And the main opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, which gets about 22-23% of the vote, is now not only a vestige of former white power and rule. White people are only about 9% of the community. It's also made deep inroads into the colored community, which is another 9% of the national population, and the Indian or the Asian community, right? Because of their fears and disgruntlement, some of which are just about the ANC, right? But often that disgruntlement overlaps with real genuine forms of anti-Blackness and surfaces electorally through a kind of anybody but Black folk alliance in the Democratic Alliance. So yes, and on the other hand, those people who are at the bottom of society, who earn the least, who make up, arguably 99% of people living in shack communities are African people, right? So we do see, it was really hard for me to ignore a certain material reality behind the analysis of anti-Blackness when it was applied to the South African context. Now, politically, what people do with that and what organizations like Abahlali do with that, I found quite interesting, because they didn't do what my inclination would have been to do, which would be to immediately mobilize, again, around a racial discourse of anti-Blackness, to name it, and then politically think about what it means for us as Black people who might be excluded from the realm of civil society, to rely on ourselves and to be quite weary of multiracial coalitions. So not only was South African society wary of engaging in any kind of discourse around race or anti-Blackness, it's not that Abahlali I found weary, but I didn't see it as much as I would have expected, right? An analysis around race. And the more I spent time with them, the more I came to believe that this was the case for a number of quite sharp reasons on the movement's part. The discourse around fighting the vestiges and the ongoing reality of white power and of racism was partially co-opted also by the same structures that Abahlali was fighting against. The ANC, certain sectors of the ANC. There was an internal break in the ANC in the early 2000s between Thabo Mbeki's ruled government and the emerging power of Jacob Zuma. And this was framed by the press as the break between the old ANC educated, a little bit more elite, and the kind of working class Zulu nationalist liberation armed struggle Mkhonto we Sizwe ANC. Jacob Zuma had been involved in the armed struggle and in exile. And it was also framed in political terms as potentially a divide between a more radical and a more neoliberal side of the ANC. Zuma was supposed to represent the interests of workers and the Black masses. And Zuma's wing became much more comfortable with deploying a discourse of the need to fight the vestiges of white power, white monopoly capital, and the need to fight for radical economic redistribution, right? Radical economic transformation. That was their discourse. But the reality from the perspective of Abahlali was that this was a newly emergent Black elite instrumentalizing an anti-racist discourse around anti-Blackness for their own gains, right? To win state power in order to fill their own pockets. And they therefore found this instrumentalist use of race combined with the colorblind denialist of race kind of over-determining the terrain on which you could put forward an analysis of being oppressed as Black people or fighting some form of anti-Blackness, living in a society that was now ruled by a Black government and a newly emergent Black elite. So I think that was my sense of why Abahlali one reason why they tread lightly. It's not that they don't talk about it. They do talk about it, right? They do talk about the persistence of raceness. They do talk about anti-Blackness, and you'll hear it in movement meetings stated by people, but they're weary of kind of being confused with or co-opted by that kind of Black middle class ANC status discourse around race that's not aligned with their own politics, they know quite obviously. Now, the second reason I think they're sometimes hesitant to deploy that analysis is because politically they still believe in internationalism. And that's not just a Black internationalism, although Africa figures quite large in their internationalism. It's a universalist internationalism, right? They believe deeply in solidarity with poor people, working people, struggling people, wherever they're found around the world. That's why they've gone out and protested on October 8th with Palestinians. They have long-standing ties to the Palestinian movement. It's also why they visit with people who are working around housing rights in the United States, in Europe, in Haiti, in Brazil with the MST. And that kind of internationalist politics, I think, is more closely aligned with what the Ghanaian political philosopher Ato Sekiotu calls a left universalism, right? The need to rediscover forms of universalism from a leftist perspective after the post-structuralist critique of universalisms. And a kind of Fanonian, humanism on some level. And it's related to the kind of Black liberation theology that was also a part of the Bikoist Black consciousness movement. But it does insist on the power of coalitions and on the liberation of all people. So again, that doesn't mean that they don't see the reality of racism or name it. And it doesn't mean, as I'm arguing, that anti-Blackness doesn't define South African society. It clearly does. But I think that those are some of the reasons why discursively that may not surface in their own struggles to the same extent that it does in other parts of the world. Now, I'm giving you long answers here, so I'll try to keep the next two brief so we can get to some of your other questions. But you asked about settler colonialism and civil society as well, and I think you summarized the settler colonialism question quite well. I think there's a lot of good work that's emerging and still remains to be done in thinking about settler colonialism more internationally. In Latin American context, people are starting to look at it in places where it isn't usually applied, and in Africa. And I think Robin Kelly is the person who I'm most indebted to for really thinking carefully and pushing back gently against Patrick Wolf's arguments, as you said, for neglecting Africa, right? Categorically, right? Because it doesn't fit the case. It doesn't fit the theory, as you said, right? We see elimination, Kelly says, in the South African context, but it's kind of a cultural elimination, right? We want your labor, but we don't want you and everything that you bring with you, right? In the South African context, it's interesting because those categories which are thought to be distinct in the U.S. context, right, kind of anti-Blackness and settler colonialism in the United States, are one and the same in the South African context. The indigenous population is Black, and they are the principal victims of settler colonialism. But then on the other hand, the kind of rediscovery and reclaiming of indigeneity is much more problematic in that context. Some of the groups that do that often you see emerge from the colored community, who claim ancestry with some of the indigenous communities in the Western Cape, but problematically kind of have to assert a kind of primordial tie to the land. And that indigeneity can also be strangely an anti-African one, as I said. It's also, indigeneity is problematic as a discourse because it maps onto the structures of rule of traditional Bantustan homelands, which were artifices of colonial and apartheid rule, right? So what does it mean to reclaim that land when the king of the Zulu people has access to way more land that is not democratically held and is a result of colonial structures of rule that persist into the present, right? Decolonization looks a little bit different. Land back looks a little bit different there, and it probably needs to be decoupled potentially from indigeneity. And the other problem with this indigenous discourse is the kind of real strong that then enters into the question of what the ongoing decolonization project looks like in South Africa to overthrow settler colonial rule, is the relationship to other Africans. Right? South Africa is the number one destination for African migrants in the world. Right? We tend to think of Germany, we tend to think of England, but the number one country recipient, last I've seen, is actually on the African continent, and it's South Africa. And despite the warm ways in which South Africans in the anti-apartheid struggle were welcomed into surrounding countries like Tanzania, Mozambique, right, Zimbabwe, Zambia, to form training camps to fight and overthrow apartheid, when those people from Mozambique, from Angola, from Malawi, from Somalia, and from South Asia come to South Africa as migrants to find jobs, they're often faced with tremendous discrimination, violence, right? That is an institutionalized violence that is promoted by the ANC and the government. That is, yes, inflected by anti-Blackness, but also, as I said, anti-South Asians, right, in nature. And so the outsider, the figure of the outsider, is really important in thinking about what decolonization looks like. And Fanon talks about that. So fighting settler colonialism with some notion of indigeneity that isn't also attentive to the role of the outsider in this story is a part of the South African challenge, as it is elsewhere, but especially so there. And with regards to the question of civil society, I think you also described it quite well, Jared, in that Abahlali describes themselves as those who do not count, right? The poor who do not count, those who are not seen to count, to matter in any shape or form, who can't be understood on the terrain of the political. And I think you're right to say that that means that they're often excluded from civil society. They're not seen as worthy as potential participants in civil society, right? In the same way that many different theorists have argued. But even though they understand that to be the conditions that they're facing and that they believe they should best organize by mobilizing on their own terms with poor people who also live in shacks, and they don't need any aspect of civil society to do that. Another thing that I found surprising as I tried to go there with an open mind to learn from this movement, which was my main motivation to encounter Abahlali, was to learn from them, was that there was a very careful relationship to those who might occupy civil society. They were more than willing to engage NGOs, to engage scholars, to engage development practitioners, to engage lawyers. These are all people we tend to think of as occupying civil society. But their one prerequisite for engaging with those different people and organizations and groups was that they be treated with dignity. And surprisingly, that one demand means that they are foreclosed from the vast majority of civil society spaces they've found, because it's so difficult for those people who occupy the space of expertise in civil society, whether they're local government officials, NGOs, academics, right? Other people who are there to help others in theory, they want to do that in a top-down way. And decolonizing our own mind about what it means to take seriously, right, the capacity to think of poor people as they insist upon requires a shift in some sense. Does that change what civil society is once we do that? I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. But they have been very successful despite that challenge at working with certain groups like the Socioeconomic Rights Institute, right? Like certain lawyers who they say, you're not just going to go in the courtroom and determine what the legal strategy is. You have to consult with us every step of the way. And we're going to make this legal strategy subordinate to the strategy of our organization, which must be decided upon collectively. So that's kind of how they relate to civil society.
Yeah, this piece this is from their website, which people can check out. I'll drop a link in the chat, but it stood out. Just they say, we are clear that our movement belongs to our members and not to any NGO, donor, political party, organization, or network that thinks it has a right to rule the organized poor, right? And so this, again, like as you're saying, that they do, and they are very clear too, and they say this further on, about their openness and their willingness to kind of engage, with all different types of groups, but that importance of them as a member organization too. And I think we have another question later to talk a little bit more about their organization, but I think it's very important, and not, the reason I'm highlighting that is because I think a lot of times within movement spaces in the United States, we kind of have this tendency to let nonprofits kind of take up too much leadership within different struggles that we have, rather than being look, you can help us with certain things, but this is what we're doing, and having that membership decision making strategy where people are able to kind of democratically, as a movement or as an organization, decide the things that they're going to do, and then people can support in different ways. We can have dialogue, but you're not going to just take our thing and subsume it to yours. Seems like an important distinction to me. So I do want to talk a little bit. This is, we could probably talk about this a little bit. I don't know if it can be a minor note, but there's discourse around development in the book that I found really interesting. You talking in part about kind of traditional, like, so capitalist. I mean, obviously this is important, again, the context of when South Africa becomes able, when South Africans, Black South Africans primarily, but when they get the ability to kind of determine their own, political, economic stuff, is also at a time when you don't get to determine it really because of neoliberalism. But there's one of the things I appreciated about this is that there's different folks that you're bringing in, whether it's Samir Amin. You're also talking a little bit about BRICS now, which is, South Africa is the S, right, in BRICS, as a, kind of alternative project, an alternative set of nation states that are thinking about development and trying to think about ways to engage it without being subsumed to a kind of agenda of the IMF or the World Bank or what Western imperialism wants to kind of impose. And then, so there's that happening at kind of like a state level of South Africa's participation in BRICS and kind of moving that way. And then there's also, which, yeah, there's also the point from below that you're making of that the movements actually, an organization like Abahlali actually is pushing for certain forms of localized development too. And that can be paired alongside with the comment that you made earlier, which is that, they South African government built 1 million houses at, a certain point. And so there is an interesting, I think, discourse around South Africa and development that you're engaging both from above and below, and, thinking about as in a post-colonial, if we use that term, a society after direct colonization. This is a big problem, right? Because these countries have to often develop infrastructure that was not given to them, because the whole point of the colonization project was often to kind of get certain exports out. South Africa might be a weird mix there because of the number of settlers and their own, the white South African independence from British rule earlier on and stuff. But anyways, I'm throwing too many things at you. So talk about how you're thinking about some of these things in the book, if you would.
Yeah, I would say that, my desire to grapple with development specifically stemmed in part from the kind of overarching methodology I deployed in the book, which was guided in part by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, who say at one point in their writing that our method, rather than projecting what people should do and what they should want, is to start where people revolt, to start from people's political passions, and from there develop political projects. And they also say that the first rule of political thought is that we must begin not from a version of people as we think they ought to be, but from people as they are. So that was part of my desire to think about development. And the other part, thinking in line with this methodology, was important for me because of my own kind of autonomous biases and political background, right? I had a built-in bias that was extremely suspicious of statist politics, which included development projects. And yet, as you said, when I encountered Abahlali, it was clear to me that development was still a demand and a part of their desire. And the second reason I think that I wanted to explore development, you also named for me, it concerned kind of what I understood to be a changing world system, basically, and a shift in the order of globalization, really. So we talked a little bit about the 1990s as the era of neoliberal hegemony. And neoliberalism arose precisely as an abandonment of the development project, right? In favor of just letting the market do its work. So in a sense, this was the era of the death of old capital D development as an explicit attempt to develop an economy in favor of the kind of free market approach to economic growth. And of course, we know that the World Bank, which is supposed to be a development bank, basically pushed poor states to let the market do its work as a way to develop by that point. And oddly enough, at the very same time that was happening in the world in the 90s, development studies was undergoing a really important criticism, in part by some people who I learned a tremendous amount from in classes with people like Arturo Escobar, and Gustavo Esteva in the Mexican context, who were kind of part of this post-development critique. And the big thing I loved about the post-development critique of development was its focus on social movements instead, right? They were saying, like, take your attention away from these different developmental programs that are being imposed, no matter what politics they align themselves with, capitalist or socialist, and turn your attention to what people are doing in their everyday lives and how they're mobilizing politically. That's much more important and potentially liberatory. But that in a weird way aligned, that critique, which was from the left, Foucauldian inflected quite often, aligned with the kind of neoliberal abandonment of development in the 1990s. Now, fast forward to our moment, right, to when I was first setting out to do research in South Africa, post-2008, post-Great Recession. And I think, again, like I was saying earlier, you can start to see the emergence of a new form of globalization. If globalization 1.0 was kind of this Washington consensus rolling out of neoliberalism, globalization 2.0 started to challenge that kind of Western-centered model. And it started to challenge Western hegemony even, right? We saw this huge rise of China that we've continued to see. And as you mentioned, alongside China, we saw parallel emerging competing geopolitical blocs. What was first BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And then in 2010, South Africa joined BRIC and it became BRICS. So it's right at this juncture when I arrived in South Africa and you started to see and hear this new ANC government under the leadership of Zuma, who became one of the biggest kleptocratic officials in ANC's history, but nonetheless rolling out this discourse of a new developmental state, right? And promising a new developmental program, a series of policies building on earlier discourses of kind of the success of East Asian states like South Korea, Hong Kong, right? Singapore, Taiwan, who the World Bank had celebrated for supposedly following neoliberal models. But the second you turn to them, you realize these countries achieve developmental success not by some pure neoliberal model at all. So all of this is swirling in the background in the wake of the Great Recession in 2008, as the global geopolitical context seems to be shifting. Western hegemony is challenged. It's not that we're seeing capitalism be challenged. It's just kind of different forms of capitalism that are emerging. And, you know, The Economist magazine in 2012 had a cover that was all about state capitalism. And it had a picture of Lenin. And are we saying we're seeing the return of state capitalism? And in fact, now we've seen all kinds of people like Ilyas Alami writing about the return of state capitalism globally now. So that I saw emerging first in South Africa, and I thought would be best to understand and situate South Africa within. And indeed, you know, after they joined BRICS in 2010, they hosted a BRICS meeting in 2013, which occurred in Durban while I was there during the longest stint doing research. And it was at that meeting that they discussed, right, a new bank the BRICS New Development Bank that could challenge the hegemony of the IMF and the World Bank. They decided then to fund it with $50 billion. Later, it was $100 billion, which came online in 2015. And it's supposedly for sustainable infrastructure, renewable energy, loans to places like southern Brazil to rebuild infrastructure after floods. So the question was always like, to what extent is this model actually going to be different from the World Bank, IMF, Western-led model? And it seems pretty clear in really important ways it's not that different, but it does represent a shift within the neoliberal order and a kind of much greater role for the state in developmental infrastructure building that can't just be explained away as just another example of neoliberalism either, right? So all that is happening in the background as I'm spending time with Abahlali. And one of the things I noticed immediately in Abahlali meetings was, as you were noting, and as I said, right, demands for development. They want houses, they want electricity, they want water, they want sanitation, they want other forms of infrastructure that are necessary for survival. They want healthcare, they want jobs, they want education, other improvements in their standard of living. And early on, right after Abahlali kind of first emerged in 2005 in a public way, protesting the local ANC and the national ANC, the local municipal government announced that they would be launching a massive housing program in the northern part of the city called Cornubia. And this became something that was referred to in Abahlali spaces as a kind of promised land, right? Something that would be a utopia with schools and services and beautiful homes in a community that was safe. And so I was interested in looking at the prospects for this massive planned development. It was supposed to offer between 10 and 20,000 units. It was supposed to be potentially mixed income, wedged right in between, on the one hand, one of these edge cities that was representative of those forms of white flight I was talking about earlier, where white people had left downtown Durban and gone to the northeast to set up shop, and where new forms of development and gated communities that parallel Southern California, that were modeled off Southern California, emerged on the one hand, and kind of these old townships zoned African and Indian on the other hand. So it was also a spatial plan for public housing that was designed to kind of bridge these, the relics of apartheid zonal spatial planning that was segregated, and provide access to jobs. So I did look quite a bit at this plan and did some interviews with some of the people involved with it. And I found out that this was not just a state plan for public housing, but a public-private partnership. And it was a partnership between the municipal government on the one hand and the largest landowner in the city, Tongaat Hewlett, which was a sugar cane company and processing company that obviously had been birthed in the 19th century under the heyday of colonial dispossession of indigenous lands, was involved with relying upon indentured labor, just like these companies were involved with in the Caribbean. This is the origin story of much of the Indian migration to South Africa. They were brought as indentured laborers to work on the sugarcane farms. And they then became a transnational enterprise that has interests all over Africa. So here you have the largest landowner in the city. The government has not embarked upon land redistribution, and the local government has entered into a partnership with them to use some of their land and expertise, because now in a global era, they're diversifying away from sugarcane and they're working towards property development, right? Residential developments to capitalize on their access to land. So I was wondering, how did this agreement come about? And what I learned with interviews with some of the planners in Tongaat Hewlett, who were quite forthright and transparent, was that it came about through backroom deals as a way to avoid land expropriation, basically, right? And It came about through backroom deals that were brokered in part by members of the Black elite who were both within the local ANC and who sat on the board of directors as a result of South Africa's equivalent of affirmative action programs in an attempt to diversify these all-white boards of directors. They argued you had to have transformation in the corporate sphere and diverse DEI, basically, right? And so some of the same people in government would sit on these boards and they have mutual interests. And one of the leaders of the ANC was able to sit down with the board of Tongaat Hewlett and say, look, we can do this the hard way. The people are arguing for land expropriation, or we can come to some sort of agreement that benefits both of us, right? And both of us means both of his personalities, because he's earning income from the company and from the government. And basically, Tongaat Hewlett gave them their worst land, unusable land for this. And they got paid market rates for it. So they sold a small portion of their land to buffer them from the threat of further land expropriation, land that they've won through colonial dispossession. They give them the worst set of land. Now, the project itself, when we said that 1 million figure, that was from the 1990s up to 2001, right? Since the 90s, South Africa has built in total almost 4 million homes. So again, it bucks the trend of neoliberal privatization of public homes, even though it's not like the old socialist state homes. These are commodities that people have titles to and they can sell themselves, right? In the way that Thatcher wanted people to be able to do in England. But nonetheless, the government is building houses, not demolishing them, as we see in many other parts of the world. And Cornubia was built. Some people got land, but not only was the development of the project done in a way that enriched the former dispossessors, colonial dispossessors, but it also was distributed in a way that made sure that nobody in Abahlali or nobody critiquing the local ANC would get a home, right? So the very same Abahlali communities that are located in shack settlements right next to Cornubia, none of their members have gotten a home in Cornubia till this day, right? So the allocation is also done by the ANC of these homes in a way that lacks a lot of transparency, to say the least, and most likely is involved with a kind of kleptocratic pay for a service kind of policy that the ANC has been accused of, and which is why people are arguing for the last 5 years plus that the state has been captured by the ANC and a whole series of public officials that are now using it to enrich themselves rather than to benefit everyday people like those in Abahlali. So what did I take away from that? Development is a problematic terrain in the South African context. It's complicated, it's contradictory, right? The way that the ANC is embarking upon it is not great at all. But, in the epigraph to the chapter in which I discuss this project, I quote from a couple people. One of them is one of my favorite thinkers, organizers, Raul Zebechi, Uruguayan scholar, who writes about development and argues that social plans, that's his term for development projects, and the militarization of the urban peripheries are really two sides of the same coin, two sides of the same attempt to control populations who are outside the reach of the state. Now, what do we make of that claim? On the one hand, he's absolutely right. When you live beyond the purview of the state, of necessity, and through political ingenuity, determination, people mobilize and organize and create alternative life worlds that are beautiful and crucial, and they are windows to other ways we could be living on the planet, and they are threats to the state. And there is a way in which development plans make the state relevant to those communities again, but can also be conceived of as forms of counterinsurgency designed to crush those autonomous liberated zones. I think that's one side of Zebechi's argument. On the other hand, I think this is just from my experience with Abahlali, I'm not sure we can totally equate the two the way that he does, social plans, development, and the militarization of the urban peripheries, right? The militarization of the urban peripheries in places like Brazil, where the military is sent in, or in places like South Africa, where the police are sent in, or the Red Ants in Cape Town are sent in to squash land occupations. to me is still not the same thing as a housing program like Cornubia, as corrupt as it may be and as part of the problem as it may be from a certain perspective. And I think that's why, at least from Abahlali's perspective, despite all the problems with the existing forms of development that they see the ANC enacting, they continue to demand development, but they're not demanding the militarization of their communities. So that was a kind of political problem, and that's how I use epigraphs in the book, not as both as inspiring, pithy statements, but also as problems that I think we have to grapple with in movements that require further thought, and that I saw Abahlali trying to think through. And their particular approach to development for me was productive for thinking about that.
I appreciate you laying all that out. So I have a two-part question, which I mean, all of them have two parts, but I actually named the two parts here. So you write a couple times in the book some version of a quote, around this notion that post-apartheid South Africa is, this is basically a paraphrase, but it's close to a quote, is simultaneously the home of the most progressive constitution in the world, at the same time maintaining the highest level of inequality of any country in the world, which I found fascinating. I probably have read that before, but it didn't stick with me as it did, when I read it in your book. And one, I mean, this is quite an indictment, I think, of the limits of, bourgeois democracy and bourgeois rights for their own sake. But it's not totally meaningless. And I think that you deal with it in a very, I appreciate the way you deal with it in the book. And, so I had sort of two questions. I'll go ahead and ask them together for the sake of this. But, one, why do you think that is the case, that they have such profound inequality, despite this transition period and this robust constitution? And then on the flip side, you demonstrate that for Abahlali, like this is a tool of sorts, right? This is something that, and presumably for other movements as well, right? That they can use these things in court. They can think about them in their organizing work. You already talked about how they engage lawyers and think, about how they're going to approach things in terms of legal strategy and movement strategy. And obviously, I think, they don't think that the right or the law is just going to, automatically deliver them the struggle. They certainly know that they have to do the work of the struggle, but talk about how they engage with this as well.
Yeah. So the first question, like, why is it the case that they have this kind of celebrated constitution and at the same time have some of the highest levels of inequality in the world? And in some senses, we might, as a first cut, attempt to answer this, give a kind of straightforward answer that legal rights are just that. They're rights, but they're not guaranteed unless you can enforce them. And we can see some of that right now with the genocide against Palestinians and the clear way in which Israel is in violation of all kinds of international laws, but nobody so far is able to actually hold Israel accountable to that reality. And in other cases, people might have rights, but you might not be aware of them, that you have those rights. So that's why even in traditional liberal discourses, like modern liberalism acknowledges the intertwined nature of rights. So in other words, without access to education, you can't really be said to have rights, because you don't know what those rights are. You don't know how to defend them, to mobilize them. So that's another reason, potentially. Of course, I also think of Marx's famous statement that between equal rights, force decides. And he has all kinds of great little remarks that are jabs at the existing liberal political theorists who thought they had developed a program to transcend the old arbitrary power of monarchs. And his class analysis of society and of capital was trying to underscore the kind of limited, contradictory, and kind of unfulfilled nature of those supposed rights. And I think where he makes that statement about between equal rights, force decides, he's talking about the working day. I think it's chapter 10 of Capital. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong. But, and, this struggle between the worker who has the right to sell their body, their capacity to work, their labor power as a commodity, and the owner of the means of production who has the right to employ it and put it to work, and will then, of course, try to use it for as much time as he possibly can. And he can do that, and they're both supposedly now equal. One is not a serf, as under feudalism, where you have no rights, you're tied to the land, you have to do what the king says. You have equality, but there is something else that interrupts that kind of nominal equality and access to rights, which is force and the material reality that if somebody owns the means of production and someone else doesn't, there's a previous relationship that has created a relationship of inequality. That equality of rights is incredibly limited, and whoever is holding the material force or the ability to enact violence is going to win that otherwise equal standoff. So that's another kind of traditional kind of Marxist explanation of the limits of rights, no matter how progressive they might seem. There's another argument about socioeconomic rights, which are distinct from political rights, obviously. And the South African Bill of Rights and the Constitution enshrines the right to human dignity, the right to equality before the law, no discrimination by race, gender, sex, ethnicity, ability, sexual orientation, the right to bodily integrity, reproductive rights, the right to protest and assemble. It has the right to movement, freedom of movement, which is really important because of the way that apartheid operates, precisely off of restricting people's freedom to move. And if you wanted to move, you needed a pass, potentially, to even have access to freedom of movement. The right to housing, right, is in there, which is interesting in this context, because it also includes the right to due process with regards to like a court-ordered eviction. So if the court says you're going to be evicted, you need, this needs to go to court, right? You can have a hearing about this and whether or not this is justified. And that was incredibly important for Abahlali and then for the country as a whole in the lead up to the 2010 World Cup, which South Africa hosted, because beginning in KwaZulu-Natal, where Abahlali is based, the provincial government passed an Elimination of Slums Act as part of their effort to clean up the cities to make them presentable for the international community and tourists that wanted to come. And so, you know, this was mapped on to the UN Millennium Development Goals desire to eliminate slums. And okay, supposedly we're doing a good thing, but what does it mean to eliminate slums? Are you just, like David Harvey says with Capital, are you engaging in a spatial fix where you just move them around out of sight of the tourists? Are you just demolishing them and expecting people to get by on their own? How are you eliminating them? Are you providing people with housing? And it was clear that the plan was to just free up the government's hand to be able to destroy shack communities for the purposes of tourism income. And Abahlali went to court with the help of the Socioeconomic Rights Institute and overturned that, took them to constitutional court and overturned that law, which was huge, not just locally, but nationally, because no sooner had they passed that in KwaZulu-Natal that all other provinces started to debate and start to pass similar measures. And when it was overthrown at the constitutional court, no other states could kind of pass similar measures. So it's meaningful. But at the same time, right, there's obvious ways in which some of these provisions have certain clauses to them. So like there's right to food, water, healthcare, and social assistance. Okay, those are like socioeconomic rights, right? But then they say that which the state must progressively realize within the limits of its resources. So there's a temporal and material delimitation of that right, qualification of that right. Progressively realize, what does that mean? 30, 40, 100 years, right? We can claim that we're still in that process of realizing the right to food and water, healthcare, and then within the limits of its resources. So you might be understanding, like I was trying to be, of the material limits that the ANC had to realize its objectives, or that might just be your excuse and say, sorry, we don't have funds. Yeah, but that's because you gave the money to some local developer instead, right? So there are qualifications on its kind of progressiveness in that sense. And then to your point about how, despite those limits, it's still important for Abahlali. It's not meaningless for them. I already gave one example of what that might look like for them, with taking the provincial government to court and winning a really important case. Every time Abahlali has a new branch launch, when a new community in a shack community joins the movement, where there's a new occupation, there's a kind of ceremony to acknowledge this. And at that ceremony, quite often, new members will be reminded of their constitutional rights to housing and their right to not be evicted. And they might read the Constitution, one, to meet that breakdown that I mentioned above. Sometimes people don't know, right? They haven't been able to go to school. That may have been communicated in English, right? That is even there. And just knowing that that's there emboldens them to go and fight for it, is the purpose of the movement, right? Not to just say we've got this Constitution, which they remind them of, that we're not saying you have this constitutional right, everything's fine. Obviously not. We're just trying to say the Constitution says you deserve a right to housing, so go fight for it and squat for that land and feel emboldened as you do that. And to me, this is all important, and this question is important because it's kind of related to the question around development. There are these ongoing conversations that are revisiting the relationship between kind of liberalism and socialism or communism. And obviously there are all these conversations around reform and revolution throughout the history of radical movements, especially in the Second International, but ever since then. These are conversations I know in the DSA and Jacobin, and they've been critiqued for kind of engaging in excessively on one side, right? The reformist side of these debates, of trying to find meaning in liberalism. But I still think these debates point to the fact that there's a there for these conversations and debates. There's still a conversation to be had. And I think, in the abolitionist movement, this takes the form of like, what exactly is the nature of a non-reformist reform? What does that mean? What does it look like? Right? I know people like Amna Akbar are really trying to think seriously about this. Other people are more skeptical that such a thing even exists, right? But I think when you get into the nitty-gritty of a movement and people are trying to fight for things, these are the kinds of questions that come to the surface. And in the South African context, the late, great Eusebius McKaiser was an incredible thinker, radio host, was probably the best defender of liberalism. This guy really believed in the promise of liberalism for South Africa, and he would fight with liberals to point out their hypocrisies. And he believed in empowering the poor and fighting as an openly queer Black man in public for people in all kinds of really interesting ways, And Richard Pithouse on the other side was arguably the greatest critic of liberalism in South Africa. And to me, when you see people operating on good faith, which is really hard to find in the United States, a liberal in good faith, that seems like a contradiction of terms. Most days, I think it definitely is. But someone like Eusebius, I think, really was trying to tease this question out in conversation with brilliant critics like Richard. And it shows up, again, coming back to Palestine where we started. This shows up in the South African case against Israel at the ICJ, right? John Dugard, one of the leading attorneys for the South African legal team, is known as a key figure in kind of legal realism and legal liberalism in some sense in South Africa. And his daughter, Jackie Dugard, is a co-founder of the Socioeconomic Rights Institute, which is one of the few organizations operating in an NGO space that could said to be operating according to the principles of kind of movement law, where you take your marching orders from movements, but where you're trying to push the legal system on its own liberal terms as far as they can go, in some kind of sense, in meaningful ways that actually impact people's lives. So those are kind of, to me at least, the South African reference points for thinking through these problems of constitutionalism, legal liberalism. And another person I should name is Tshepo Madlengozi, who's thought a lot about the limits of the Constitution from a kind of decolonial and critical race theory perspective, and who also has, no surprise, written about Abahlali as a kind of critique, but also embodiment of certain principles of the Constitution. So,
thank you. All right, we got a couple more. I do want to get to both of these because these are very important questions to me. But we we need to talk more about Abahlali's politics, about the kind of institutions that they, self-organize, the modes of self-organization, even, to some degree. It's always hard for me when somebody says like a social movement has 150,000 members, which is what they now claim, to even imagine that in like a United States context. Um, I mean, I think DSA claims to have 100,000 paper members, right? But it's not that many people who are actually like really participating. But we're talking about people who are self-organizing, as you say, occupations, chapters of this. Um, and so then also, I think it's really interesting the organization that they do around education, radical education, the work that they do around like social reproduction, childcare, things like this. Um, so say a little bit about that, as well as like how they structure themselves, in terms of, they're not a vanguardist organization, so they have a different kind of structure. And yeah, anyways, just yeah, whatever you want to throw in there about them.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So some examples of the kind of locally based programs and committees that they might have in a shack community include things like community creches to provide access to childcare, which is a huge need in these spaces, huge need. And those creches often can become kind of meeting spaces in a shack community where space is under high demand and not readily available. They organize also something that they call Abahlali University, a university of the poor, which are long study sessions in which they again insist on their capacity to think for themselves, in which they may debate, abstract questions from what is the nature of neoliberalism. They may read a text like Wretched of the Earth together, which now has just been translated into isiZulu, which is an incredible accomplishment. I know it's going to be used in Abahlali spaces. So they may discuss kind of, what the meaning of socialism or communism or Abahlalism is to them. There may be all-night meetings that they call these universities. There may be questions of strategy. They also have locally organized soccer teams, right? Community gardens is something that you'll often see in these shack communities, particular in some of the communities outside Durban that have been the center of a lot of their organizing. Youth festivals, there's a women's league. So they also organize an annual Unfreedom Day, which corresponds with what the ANC calls the Freedom Day to represent the end of apartheid. And their argument is that we are not yet free. So ours is an Unfreedom Day in which thousands of their members would gather at a local soccer field or an open park. There'll be different speeches, there'll be dances, there'll be a choir group, which are other things that they do, all sorts of cultural activities. They have regular assemblies annually and then kind of broken up for the movement as a whole, where kind of questions of movement strategy are discussed, where the central leadership body is elected every year. And then there are meetings at the level of a branch, right, which would be a very specific shack community. And in order to join the movement, their overarching organizational principle is self-organization. So before you can join, you have to have gathered at least 50 people in your particular community, your neighborhood, your shack community, who want to join the movement. And then there's a series of meetings before you're kind of signed up and welcomed into the organization, in which the notion of self-organization and accountability at the local level is driven home. So it's not just that you join and then expect the central leadership to either provide you with the things that you want, because they don't have the access to that to do that, right? They constantly have to reinforce the idea that they're not the state, that they're also not a political party where they're going to try to get you to do something for them, to turn out to vote, right? This is an organization predicated upon you taking direct control over your political organizing in your community, and then meeting up with other people on a horizontal basis to try to strengthen your initiative and share strategies for what worked and what didn't work. It's not an organization that's going to come in with a bunch of resources and solve your problems and build you homes, right? It's an organization to strategize collectively around how to best occupy land, how to, use the law, how to confront an armed militia of the ANC or any other political party in your neighborhood. So that principle of organizational autonomy really sits at the center of all of those different kinds of activities that they engage in.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. All right, so this question, yeah, I do want to talk about this because there's this interesting reflection in the book. You talk about, the Economic Freedom Fighters, or the EFF, which is a party that, if folks don't pay attention to South African politics, they probably wouldn't know, but it is Malema, right, is the name of the leader, and they have a more left-wing agenda for sure. There's definitely, I mean, one of the things I remember Eugene Puryear telling me this after he came back from a visit to South Africa, I think to visit the South African Workers' Party. Is that there's a new one, relatively new socialist party that was founded that's connected to one of the really large labor unions, right?
It's the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party.
That's it. Yeah. And he had just said, like, visiting, he could understand why land was such a key issue, why it was such a, because the relic of the apartheid system, and the land that was built up through colonization had not been, redistributed in any kind of effective way. And you talk about that in the book too, in terms of the willing buyer and the willing seller, kind of system. But, you could see how a party like EFF and Abahlali could, in many ways, their agendas are very similar. They might complement each other. But there are these organizational differences too. EFF has a more, I think you say, a vanguardist, kind of approach. They certainly are doing politics, trying to run as a parliamentary, and ideally presidential, trying to run the state essentially, which Abahlali does not have, doesn't have that desire for themselves, which is an interest. Maybe we should say a little bit more about that too, because I think that's an interesting thing as well, because they, as you've already noted, like, they see a role of development, and they recognize that they need and want things from the state, and that the state is something that they're trying to sort of wrestle things from in terms of their demands, but they don't actually have an aspiration towards running the state, right? So there's an interesting relationship there. So I know that, like, right now, if we look at it, it's actually, as you said, it's the Democratic Alliance, which is a more conservative force, historically a white force, although it's more diverse now. That's kind of the dominant challenger, or the second largest party to the ANC. But I'm interested in, what you see or think about the possibilities of a kind of new left coalition emerging at some point. And if you think that there are levers of the state that a left-wing party could use to move things in a more progressive direction in South Africa.
Yeah, this is such an interesting question in the South African context, and in many different parts of the world, right? Movements obviously struggle with this relationship of how you relate to electoral politics, and the EFF is a fascinating example of a purportedly radical political party. In the book, as you noted, I tell the story of a meeting that I was able to sit in on between local representatives of the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, and Abahlali in 2013, just after the EFF was launched. And I should note also, in this kind of periodizing that we've been giving the audience of the kind of 1990s transition, Nelson Mandela, the kind of break with that post-political transition in the late 90s, early 2000s, the first sequence, the first rupture with the post-apartheid consensus up to 2004. Abahlali emerges in 2005, when from 2004 to 2012, South Africa was one of the largest numbers of protests in the world, but most of those protests are outside the confines of organizations. Abahlali was kind of an exception in that period because it was popular protest without a clear organizational representative of those protests. And then in 2012, another break occurs. And a kind of third sequence of post-apartheid protest begins to emerge, starting with Marikana. And you start to see the traditional subjects of struggle come back to the foreground. Workers, in this case, mine workers, who'd been really important to the anti-apartheid movement, but they're going on wildcat strikes against their own unions. And the ANC encourages the police, right, to go in and crush them, and massacres 34 mine workers. This is a really important moment because massacres defined the anti-apartheid struggle, right? Starting with Sharpeville massacre. And so the question of the continuities in forms of apartheid and state violence really come to the surface. And that's a part of what was breaking apart the ANC hold on power, were those moments of tremendous state power that they were clearly state violence that they were complicit with, directed at their own people, right? Mine workers, poor black mine workers. So you see the labor struggle emerge. There's a break in the labor movement at that moment, 2012, 2013, and arguably the most radical union that you mentioned, the National Union of Metal Workers, NUMSA, breaks from the Congress of South African Trade Unions, which had been in alliance. They were kind of kicked out, right? And they're like, thank you, bye. We don't, because they were too critical of the ANC. So these union structures break. And then in 2013, the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is another break because the leadership of the EFF, people like Julius Malema and Floyd Shivambu, came out of, many of their leaders of the EFF came out of both the ANC Youth League and the South African Communist Party. And if you remember, that was Mandela's own course. He came out of the ANC Youth League and he broke with the old guard when he was arguing for armed struggle. And that's why he was imprisoned, was because he was a key instigator of the armed struggle in Mkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, right? That was the armed wing of the ANC. So the Youth League has a long history in kind of being the radical edge of the ANC. And the Communist Party is supposed to be more radical than the ANC, but in coalition government with the ANC. But some of their most vocal leaders saw that the SACP and the ANC was now a part of the problem. And they broke off to form in 2013 this Economic Freedom Fighters political party, founded explicitly on Marxist-Leninist and Fanonian principles. That's in their constitution, in their charter. So I don't know of many other political parties that claim to be Fanonist in orientation, in addition to Marxist-Leninist. And part of what was unique about them is there was one section of their movement early on that came out of the kind of new Black consciousness, neo-Black consciousness, neo-Bikoist movement as well. And you saw a really strong discourse around race from the EFF and around the need to confront the persistence of white capital, around the need to engage in land reform by any means necessary, not willing buyer, willing seller, not paying off in exchange for land reform, give us our land back. So a really radical discourse that terrified self-respecting liberals, white folks, pretty much anyone who thought that they had transcended this moment of open antagonism. And again, like I said, moved into this non-racialist future. And here you get Malema being like, white folks are still the problem and we're coming for what's ours. And ANC, you're a part of the problem. You're just a shill for white people. That's basically the argument, right? So some people were really excited by this. Other people were kind of like, I wonder what's going to happen here. And it was difficult to parse amongst the criticisms those who were just scared of their explicit discourse around fighting racism and white power and need for material rights and claiming Marxist-Leninism, Fanonism, and those who had more substantive concerns. So it was interesting to me. I think once again, and in a sense, my whole book is an attempt to see South African society and Africa as a whole and the world as a whole from the lens of Abahlali, right? The lens that their particular analysis of the world and epistemology and positioning affords them. Because I think they parse that problem really easily, and you saw it in this movement space. I would struggle with some academics who I respected who were scared of the EFF because I wasn't sure if they couched their criticism of the EFF in good radical terms. I was still like, but are you really just scared because they're talking about race and like anti-blackness? Like, let's be honest here, right? Like, are you like a more traditional Marxist who doesn't want them to wade into race? And right, what are you scared about here exactly? Whereas with Abahlali, it was so much clearer, as things often are once you hunker down with movements. They basically said to the EFF, and they met with the EFF. And the reason for the meeting was because there had been a news release that said, press release, some report in the news media that said that Abahlali had joined the EFF. And that was not true. So Abahlali was like, no, hasn't happened. And so the EFF called this meeting purportedly to apologize, first and foremost. And they kind of opened the meeting like that, saying, we want to apologize. We're not sure how that message got out there. We know you have not said any such thing, and we will retract any statement that says that. But we also want to take advantage of this need to apologize, to try to get to know you, to hear about your movement and see if there might be a way we can work together. And Abahlali, had been interested in following the EFF like they follow all political events. And they kind of told them gently, like, yeah, no, it's good. Thank you for coming. You've already beaten a lot of other people who don't even bother to come talk to us. They're scared of us. We're not worthy of attention. And thank you for the humble way that you began this meeting, right? We appreciate that too. We accept your apology, and it's really important that nobody speaks for us and claims we've done something when we haven't. And we agree with your political platform. We agree with it because it's ours, right? This is what we've been fighting for the last 10 years, land redistribution, right? An economic transformation, right? Economic freedom. We're not free yet. That's what we've been arguing. So we'd be crazy to disagree with your platform. Our concern is about your legitimacy and trustworthiness as political figures. And part of that is related to our concern with political parties in general, they said. When the movement began, one of the most popular slogans that they picked up on from the Landless People's Movement, the AEC, and other movements was no land, no house, no vote. Until there's land redistribution, until we actually have formal homes, we're not going to vote. We're going to abstain from voting, right? Because that is to cede legitimacy to a system that shouldn't have any legitimacy as long as it hasn't done what it said it was going to do. Why should we vote for someone who hasn't done the first struggle objective of giving us homes and redistributing land? But as time went on, and by the time the EFF was founded, Abahlali had faced such tremendous repression multiple times, first at Kennedy Road, at the hands of what was clearly an ANC organized mob in which they were run out of the community. People's homes were burned. They had to go underground. And then later there were assassinations that same year while I was there. So the repression was ramping up. The violence, almost always at the hands of the state, the police, usually ANC hit squads, was real. And they began to reconsider and reevaluate their official stance on abstention and to wonder whether or not engaging in some forms of electoral politics, even on a tactical level, might be to their advantage. And they were precisely engaged in those conversations when the EFF launched as a party. But what they told the EFF was, first, you need to understand we're a social movement, not a political party. There's a big difference. Back to your earlier point about their insistence on where they stand. But that didn't necessarily preclude working with political parties. They didn't have an official stance on that, per se. They just said, we don't vote. And they would denounce all political parties. But they said, your people at the top of your party are somewhat questionable people. They come out of the ANC and the SACP. Those organizations are rotten to their core, Abahlali argued. And therefore, we are suspicious about their ability to reproduce, or their inability. We think they might be unable to break with that mode of doing politics, and they might be tainted by it. How do we know, they asked the EFF, that Malema's not just going to do exactly what Jacob Zuma has done, speaking some similar discourse about the need to fight white monopoly power, and meanwhile filling his pockets with as much of state funds as he possibly could. So when I talked to some people after that meeting, which left on kind of like, we're going to do our thing, we're going to keep our eyes on you, we may be able to work together, we don't know, but not right now. Like, we'll keep eyes on you. We want to see something besides talk. Like, we'll judge you based off your actions, is what Abahlali said. The EFF, was able to chip away electorally at some of the ANC's power, and in 2014 won 6% of the national vote, and then in 2019 won 11%. Most recently, they're back at around 9 or 10%. So they've chipped away. That's significant for a radical Marxist-Leninist, Fanonist party. However, Abahlali's skepticism has also been vindicated, because a number of their members and the party as a whole have been embroiled in corruption scandals, right, of the EFF. And some of those corruption scandals, like one with the VBS Bank, the Venda Building Society Mutual Bank, involved skimming off pensioners' funds. So the very people that EFF dresses up as when they go into parliament, they wear red overalls, claiming to represent the interests of workers and the enforced dress code of workers. They were found to have been stealing money from to enrich their own pockets. And that was just one example of corruption that they've been embroiled in. That's one problem. The other problem is persistent criticisms of kind of a patriarchal structure, very top-down, male-dominated, which often goes with, but we know shouldn't be completely equated with the kind of very militant, discursive positions, quite often, posturing. Unfortunately, they're often very patriarchal, and the EFF has been accused of that. And then the kind of top-down organizing model that Abahlali said political parties engage in, that vanguardist model, the EFF is explicitly vanguardist, right? And openly vanguardist. And that is something Abahlali finds very difficult to find a way around. It just clashes with their kind of insistence on organizational autonomy, the dignity of the poor, the ability of the poor to think for themselves, that we don't need a leadership structure to tell us what to do. So nonetheless, the surprising thing about Abahlali's kind of revisiting of the question of whether to endorse a political party, always tactically, not strategically, not join a political party, but kind of say, okay, we're encouraging our members, if you're going to vote for these guys this time. They've done that multiple times. In 2014, they shocked a lot of people by tactically endorsing the Democratic Alliance. Now, the Democratic Alliance is exactly that example of what I argued was an anti-Black alliance. It's more neoliberal party. They use the discourse of fighting corruption and efficiency. They're right that the ANC has been corrupt, but are they genuine in their anti-corruption and efficiency? That's very questionable. They're obviously very neoliberal and anti-poor and anti-Black. But Abahlali argued on a local level for a tactical move that would weaken the ANC and give them a bit of a buffer from the tremendous violence that they were facing on a local level. Now, they lost a lot of friends as a result of that, no matter how many times they insisted on saying, we're not joining the DA. No way. We know what they are. We're just saying to vote for some of them this time because it's the only game that seems capable of chipping away at the ANC's power. And we're convinced that if we chip away at the ANC's power, that might protect us a little bit. Now, since then, a number of people who were quite critical of them for that decision have come out and argued, actually, it worked in their favor because it did give them the buffer that they said it would. Assassinations and repression did go down for a period of time. Doesn't mean that the DA is the path to liberation. Abahlali thinks it's definitely not. In 2019, they endorsed the party you were talking about, and they've had the most positive potential alliance with the National Union of Metal Workers, which would be beautiful example of the kind of predominantly unemployed, precariously positioned social reproductive struggles aligning with struggles around the workplace that NUMSA offers and traditional worker models. They have quite a healthy relationship. They built one slowly over the last 10 years, and they made a tactical decision not to join the party, but to encourage their members to vote for them. Unfortunately, that party, the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party, has really struggled to get off the ground in any meaningful sense, right? They're not tapping into the coffers of donors like the EFF has done, both skimming off the top. EFF had to go to prominent evangelical preachers in Nigeria to get endorsements as well, because they knew it would pay off down the road. This is the dirty stuff of electoral politics that opens doors for you, but obviously makes you compromise at the same time. And then most recently in 2024, Abahlali encouraged their members to vote for the EFF. And that was after 10 years of the EFF eventually being proven to be precisely the worrisome kind of corrupted party that Abahlali said they were worried about. And so they again lost a lot of support from certain sectors of the left for that decision, because despite the initial promise of the EFF, many on the left have argued that this can no longer be a kind of progressive alternative. They've oscillated between an anti-corruption kind of discourse and signing an oath in the name of Thomas Sankara that I won't steal from the people, and clearly being accused of stealing from the people, between a discourse that is supposed to be against patriarchy and reproducing patriarchy structurally. And most recently, and perhaps most worryingly, if we track the elections, because your question is about the prospects for an electoral alternative for road to power here, an alternative to the ANC on the left, something substantively different. The ANC recently in this year's election suffered its greatest defeat. They won its peak in 2004, 70% of the vote. Then in 2009, it was 66%. In 2014, it was 62%. In 2019, it was 57%. And in this election, they won 40% of the vote. So their numbers are imploding. It's important to note, and this is what political scientists never do, ask a question about who's not voting, because overall voting has also been going down from 90% in 1994 to 89%, 77%. Only 58% of the public voted in this year's election. So that's a trend we see in many other parts of the world, where people become disillusioned with electoral politics. And rather than viewing those non-voters like liberals do as part of the problem, Barack Obama wagging his finger at them, right? We should understand they're an informed constituency that has understood the bankruptcy of a certain form of electoral politics. And that's happening in South Africa as well. But the most worrying part of the ANC's most recent turnout dip to 40% was the question of who filled the gap. Where are those votes going? And I said the DA has remained somewhat consistent for the last three elections, around 20 to 22%. That's the neoliberal, anybody but Black folks, I'm calling party, right? We're going to be efficient deliverers of services, but really we want a little bit more free market policy and less corruption is their argument. The EFF was 6%, then 11, and then 9. So they're not getting more power. So where did the votes go? Jacob Zuma, who was the former president, who was then run out of office on his own corruption charges, despite his discourse of radical economic transformation, brought up on all kinds of trials of corruption. He actually came to prominence on a rape charge in which he openly boasted about his right to women's bodies. And when asked about the threat of HIV/AIDS at the height of the AIDS crisis, said, I washed myself afterwards, no problem, right? And he was, like Trump, more celebrated and favored because of that kind of patriarchal, viciously, and homophobic discourse as well. He was really Trump before Trump, right? In terms of that kind of right-wing populist appeal to an economic nationalism, right? But really socially quite right-wing and really in it for himself. So he decided, okay, if you guys want to come after me, ANC, I'm going to start my own party. And I'm going to call it Mkonto Wesizwe, again, the militarized discourse. I'm going to take the name of the ANC's armed movement, the Spear of the Nation, that I was involved with, make it the name of my political party. And without any party infrastructure, but just the pure cult of personality that surrounds him and a certain degree of ethnic nationalism around Zulu politics, which is why the ANC saw some potential in him, because they thought that as a member of the ANC, he might erode the kind of ethnic Zulu nationalist politics of the Inkatha movement. He reproduced that and won 15% of the national vote, way more power than the EFF. Locally, where Abahlali was founded in Durban in KwaZulu-Natal, I think it was 40 to 50% of the vote, right? This is the Zulu homeland, right? Traditional homeland. And the number 2 person in charge of the EFF, Floyd Shivambu, defected from the EFF and just went to go join Mkhonto weSizwe, right? Jacob Zuma's party, a party that they had been railing against as part of the problem, as emblematic of corruption, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the state of the South African electoral politics. It's not positive. And unfortunately, the EFF, as positive as they seem to potentially be, and they have had some positive effects by being in parliament and by really inserting a certain version of the left discourse, they're so embroiled in their own problems and now clearly implicated with the very same power structure that they're railing against, as indicated by Shivambu's defection, that it's hard to point to them as a meaningful alternative at this point. And so to answer your question, that's a really long answer to say that electoral alternatives right now are actually few and far between, and the situation is quite bleak on that front in South Africa.
Wow. Well, I appreciate you sharing all of that. And I think it is interesting, long term because of that decline of the ANC, which I think makes a lot of sense. But yeah, unfortunately, doesn't sound like the alternatives on the horizon look very promising. So anyway, hopefully they can, there can be. Do you think there's any possibility that, because one of the things that I find, and we don't have a parliamentary system in the United States, so I don't really, it's a different world that I have to wrap my head around, but do you think there's any potential for kind of left alignments within, the various parties that are, one of the things that I find interesting about South Africa is that, maybe not all of the parties, I can't speak for all of them, but I know like for the ANC, for a number of the parties, there is a lot of understanding of, of Marxism, there's a more there is a left discourse, I guess, and a left set of demands and ideas, right, that I think exists among a lot of different parties. But yeah, there's a lot that are fairly small, and I don't know. It's interesting with the history of the ANC and it shrinking. It's just sort of, I guess it's too much to prognosticate probably, but yeah, anyway, that's interesting.
Well, just to speak to that, because you asked the question about the possibility for kind of these alliances, because the ANC for the first time has below 40%, and because it's a parliamentary system, they have to form an alliance to get above that 50% to form a government. So who did they go into alliance with? They went into alliance with the Democratic Alliance, the DA, and with the Inkatha Freedom Party, which is like 4%. They haven't gone away, right? The kind of Zulu nationalist regional party, people that they were potentially going to have a civil war with in the early 1990s, who don't represent any progressive platform. The EFF is seen as their biggest threat now with Jacob Zuma's Mkhonto weSizwe. So some people, when Floyd Shivambu left the EFF to go join Mkhonto weSizwe, were saying this is part of the grand strategy of the EFF to form a coalition with MK. He's not leaving. They're forming a bigger alliance. It seems clear from Julius Malema's statements since then, they've had a real serious falling out that has played out part in public, despite their attempts to keep it behind the scenes. This was not part of some grand strategy, but it may end up being an alliance that they pursue regardless between the MK and the EFF. And if the EFF goes into alliance with the MK, that tells you basically, in my opinion, everything you need to know about the EFF's left credentials or lack thereof. That is a really dangerous formation to enter into alliance with, even on an instrumentalist basis. So, I mean, again, that's why I ended with this notion of bleakness. I mean, it's really bleak. It's bleaker than it was. I was much more hopeful about the prospects of the EF early on, and some people chastised me for that. And I still think they did a lot of good and still can on some level. But to say that they represent a dignified alternative in any shape or form in electoral politics is, I think, too much of an overstatement. And, you know, the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party, I had a lot of hopes for them coming out of NUMSA. I think NUMSA is an incredible organization. They do really good work. They have a Pan-African school outside of Johannesburg that I've taught at, where they bring, organizers from all over the African continent, journalists from all over the African continent to talk about radical ideas. They're one of the few union movements that has tried explicitly to reach out to organizations like Abahlali, take them seriously, boost them in all kinds of ways. And they have, thousands and thousands of members in a really serious organization. So there's always possibility that something like that might come out of this. But from the existing structures that seem to have been compromised so far, it's hard to see how that'll be rolled back. Might hope of a next generation coming about, taking over the reins of some of these parties, but I don't see that so far. But again, we see in other parts of the world, new parties come onto the scene like MK did this time, and you can ride the wave of popular discontent, even if you don't necessarily have infrastructure or a name that's recognizable, precisely because so many people are disillusioned with electoral politics. So that's not to say that something new couldn't emerge. In fact, it needs to. It just doesn't seem to be, anywhere that we've, seen so far or heard of.
Do you think that this is the question I have sometimes, is like, do you think that the history of like the ANC with the Communist Party and like the kind of institutionalization of, the left and certain left ideas, that it actually works against like a real left alternative in certain ways? Like, I think about this sometimes in the, in after colonialism, right? Of, colonialism gets toppled often by a, in some cases, a Marxist-Leninist party or whatever, and then that party has to govern through kind of neoliberalism in a very difficult transition, and then there's kind of a, compromises and conservativization of things over time, and they become the kind of, they become the problem in a certain point, or they become the thing that people have to, but in some ways, because they have had these also left-wing, principles or ideas that they've run on, that, even in the United States, to some degree, I feel like the Democrats, who are not a left-wing party at all, but, everything is sort of like, they're terrible because they're communists, and it's like, no, that's not the problem. I don't know. It's just an interesting thing for me to think about sometimes.
Yeah, I think you're on to something. I don't think I have an easy answer. I think because on the one hand, my own romantic attachments to the left, to communism, both capital C and small c, right, are part of what attracted me to South Africa. And I think, you just have a really rich history, and the conversation starts at a level that we know in the United States. It's just like, we're just trying to get going and can't even get, people already know and take certain things for granted. And that is so welcoming and reassuring. But, your question is kind of like, well, what did they have to show for it? And is there a way that could be an impediment because of all the traditional left's problems? And I think, without being able to answer it definitively one way or another, I think there is easily a case to be made for the restrictions that the institutionalization of certain left-wing ideas imposes on you, and therefore necessarily places certain limits on your imagination of what's possible. And there's an internal policing of what it means to be a member of the left and not a member of the left. So again, for me, that's why Abahlali is so interesting, because Their members come from across the board, people who weren't politicized, people who were workers, people who were anti-apartheid activists, people who were ANC activists, people who were in other political parties, you know, across the board, people who were born after apartheid, lots of people who have nothing, don't even know what anti-apartheid movement was about. But they come from people who live in shacks, people who have been forgotten, people who are not treated seriously, who are not thought capable of thinking, and people who are, you know, either unlikely to be too deeply embroiled in some of those traditional left debates, or if they've had exposure to them, they might take only the interesting stuff. You know, they might have attended some Communist Party political education program and they got Lenin in a way just because they read it on their own rather than the party line on Lenin. And that's a lot more interesting to me. That's a lot more interesting. You can do a lot more with that. I wish other groups, I wish the traditional left was able to recognize the potential and the genius that exists in spaces like Abahlali and worked to build with them. Unfortunately, they haven't done enough of that.
Yeah. I'm gonna let you get out of here soon because I know we're running up on 3 hours. I really appreciate it. I had a lot of questions, and there was a lot that we also didn't get to in this book, and it's been great to talk to you. But one question from the audience that came up that I wanted to see if you could speak to any more is, people were a couple of different comments about this, about people being curious about, conversations with MST, the landless workers movement in Brazil, which I think you mentioned at one point, and you mentioned in the book in terms of the different movements, and maybe we could even broaden it out a little bit because you also talk about the kind of Latin American, some of the Latin American movements that also you saw some connection to between their work and the work of Abahlali.
Yeah, so I think they've been able to send some of their members to Brazil on a number of different occasions, both to attend meetings like there was a right to the city, kind of urban convening that was partially organized by the UN or some sector of the UN early on, but also specifically to attend and visit with the MST. And to attend some of the schools that the MST hosts, to attend some of the encampments, the occupations that they have. So there is a direct, at this point, cross-pollination of struggles between the MST and Abahlali. There's an intentional exchange. People from the MST have come to visit South Africa as well. And I think there's a forthcoming interview that Richard Pithouse did with George Bonono that will likely touch on this. I know that one of those interviews came out with Sbuzi Kode in the Boston Review. An excerpt of it did, which I really encourage people to check out to hear about Sabu's own organizing trajectory. I don't know where this interview is going to appear, but George talks a little bit about the centrality of the MST. And you'll see MST flags, right, when you go to some of the encampments and land occupations that Abahlali holds. So there's a real deep affinity. And there's a similar, just like Paulo Freire was central for the MST and the liberation theology in Abahlali, Paulo Freire, the pedagogy of the oppressed, has been extremely important to their University of the Poor, how they conduct their kind of study groups, as has a parallel version of kind of Black liberation theology, that wing and certain sectors of the church that come out of Black consciousness. So the same way MST, they raise Che and Jesus, right? There is a liberation theology, Jesus current coming out of Black consciousness and alliance with certain sectors of the church within Abahlali as well. So lots of resonance and direct ties with the MST that's a part of their internationalist politics that I think we really need to learn from, how to replicate that in other parts of the world.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been great. I'm glad we got to go through all of this. Thank you for taking the time to answer all of my questions and to respond to the audience as well. And we'll do another one that maybe we can give people a little bit of a teaser on this as we close out. But you basically, you know, my recollection of this, and I haven't gone back to read the piece yet, but you wrote a piece about thinking with Cedric Robinson's work, and some of it is unpublished, right? Or not? Yeah. You know, thinking about his sort of revolutionary theory, similar these questions of sort of revolutionary subjectivity within his work. And part of why I'm thinking about it is that your response to that last question, you know, one of the things we didn't talk about in this book that you do bring into the book is the idea of Robinson thinking with the Black radical tradition and kind of the way that, not that you say that they don't use, you know, Abahlali is not using that term and necessarily pulling from Robinson's work there, but that you see a resonance kind of, you know, within their organizing with some of the things that Robinson was noticing and attending to. You know, in the Black radical tradition, which I always like to remind people is not a set of scholars or Black Marxists, right? But is actually a current of kind of revolutionary struggle that Robinson's thinking with within African diasporic communities, we could say.
Yeah. Yeah. Right on. I totally look forward to that conversation. I think it'll be a great place to pick up on, because it picks on your question of kind of the limits of some of the traditional left currents in the South African context. And as you said, Abahlali's own Black radical politics. And I just want to thank you and your audience for always being such good readers. Really appreciate the work that you do here. And it's a lot of fun to be in conversation. So looking forward to the next one.
All right. Thank you, Yousuf. Much appreciated. Have a good one.
All right. You too.